And even sometimes speaking at Tory party conference, you would do a speech, I believe, without ever having written down a script.
Yes.
Which meant that sometimes you were brilliant, but forgive me for saying this, sometimes you were not brilliant.
Oh, no, absolutely.
Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Spectator TV. Before we get going, don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss another episode. First up, it's Michael Gove with his former voice coach, Graham Davies, to ask what's happened to Britain's great political speakers.
Thinking about Keir Starmer and the impact of Leonie Mellinger, why do you think Keir Starmer felt that he needed a voice coach, and what impact, if any, do you believe that she's actually had on his presentation?
Well, if you look at video tapes of him doing big keynote speeches before the voice coaching and videotapes of him doing big speeches after the voice coaching, you'll see that there's virtually no difference. So I can't believe that there has been very much focus on the voice alone. I would suggest that perhaps Leonie Mellinger has focused on other things, but it's very hard to define them because the difference is so small. If I were advising Keir Starmer, which I'm not and never will do, I would suggest that it's not his voice that is the problem, it's his addiction to cliches. Let me be clear about this. I will take no lectures from the party on the other side of the house because I'm getting on the job of filling in the black hole of £22 billion and delivering for hard-working British families. I mean, that isn't political messaging. That's word-shaped air. He really needs to get some fresher phrases to convey his old ideas.
And when you see Keir Starmer, whether it is at the dispatch box or on broadcast, are there any aspects of the way in which he communicates which are effective, either in terms of clarity or in terms of punch? So even though he uses cliches, is he at least, to the neutral listener, capable of getting a particular message across?
His DNA is deeply imbued with that of being a barrister. He does prepare a case, but of course, cases, even in a criminal court of law, are often very dour, often very dry. And you can tell that he's done the preparation, but he has done his preparation and does his delivery as a barrister. There's no hint of a showman about him. And these days, to be really effective as a political leader, you've just got to have a smattering of show business about you, like, for instance, Zelensky.
And are there, thinking of the current Labour front bench, the current cabinet and others, are there any of them that do have a whiff of stardust? Any of them who, even if they don't have the heroic style of a Zelensky, at least make you sit up and listen?
The last Labour MP that really impressed me with a speech outside of the House of Commons and a speech inside the House of Commons was somebody that you'll find surprising, Hilary Benn.
Yes.
His father, of course, was an exceptional speaker, but what Hilary Benn manages to do is to inject precision with an appropriate amount of passion. I still remember the speech he did in favour of bombing Syria,
yes,
quite a few years ago, where he quite blatantly said to the other side of the house, "You'll forgive me, but my speech is aimed at my own colleagues behind me."
Yes.
And it was brilliant the way he grabbed the issue, which was very difficult for many members of the Labour Party, especially for people on the left wing of it, including himself, and really made a striking difference to people's thoughts. And very few speeches in the House of Commons really do that.
Yeah, I was there and heard Ben's speech. It was electric. And, of course, he was addressing a divided party. And Jeremy Corbyn and others were deeply uncomfortable with the way in which he made his case. But it was both morally clear and also politically, rhetorically effective. You've advised Conservative MPs and Conservative ministers over the past. When they're addressing either the House of Commons or seeking to get selected, when they're talking to constituency associations, or when they're appearing at party conferences and talking to the nation as well as to the party, are there different registers that they have to employ?
The biggest challenge, I think, for MPs of all colours and especially as you mentioned in the very specialised genre of candidate selection, is that they have to get to the point and stay there, rather than doing several minutes of waffle, of background, and eventually building up to something. People's attention spans are getting shorter and shorter. And the most significant register I would suggest that has to be relevant for any political speaker, especially on the Conservative side, is to try and come up with something that I call a micromessage. A micromessage is a sequence of words that quickly and compellingly captures the essence of your message, but in a way which is specifically tailored to that particular audience at that particular time. A micromessage is what you want to remember and what you want the audience to remember long after you have left the room. And I believe that the best way of making you a compelling, persuasive speaker is to start off by creating your micromessage and then seeing what material you can come up with to support it.
So in a way, what you're trying to do is to distill the message down to an essence, so that you can say that even though I've been invited to speak for 3 minutes, even though I'm addressing the House of Commons for 10 minutes, there is, at the end of it, one particular phrase that should resonate and one particular argument that should land.
Yes, indeed. One particular phrase, one particular argument that is so strong that the evidence for that argument will also stick in your mind. Now, Michael, you've been an audience member as well for an inordinate amount of speeches in the House of Commons and elsewhere. Are there many from which you can remember the equivalent of a micromessage and 2 or 3 supporting key elements?
Yes, I suppose, well, one of the best speeches in the House of Commons that I remember was when William Hague was Shadow Foreign Secretary, and the case that was being debated was the Lisbon Treaty, which would have created a president of Europe, and at that time there was some speculation that it might be Tony Blair. And William Hague had this magnificent, long, drawn-out narrative of what would happen if Tony Blair drew up to the gates of Downing Street as President of Europe in order for Gordon Brown to meet him and pay obeisance. And it was a hilarious projection of what might occur. But the message that was being rammed home was just how uncomfortable it would be, not just for Gordon Brown, but for Britain to accept that it was ceding sovereignty and that whoever happened to be Prime Minister would be under the cosh of whoever happened to be the newly elected President of Europe.
Well, that was a hilarious speech and a really great reaction. As you can see on YouTube, if you care to look at it now, a genuinely ecstatically amused reaction from both sides of the House. But it's interesting for me, speaking to you, because your memory is very good. Sometimes it's almost too good, Michael. But it's interesting that the example that you immediately come up with of a really memorable speech was from about 12 or 13 years ago?
More than that, yes.
Yes, indeed. I would suggest to you that over the last 5 years, there aren't many speeches where you can remember a really compelling micromessage and the evidence to back it up.
No. I think one of the best speeches ever was one of the shortest, which is Charlie Walker, when in one of the Brexit debates where he said, I think, if not now, when, and then sat down. So that I remember. I also remember in the immediate aftermath of Rachel Reeves' budget, the reply from Rishi Sunak. It was almost the last thing he did as leader of the opposition. And there, I think he was genuinely fired up because he felt that the warnings that he'd issued during the general election campaign had been vindicated. Taxes had gone up. And even though he might have lost the election, he was now trying to say, I won the argument because you've been forced to do precisely what I predicted you would do. And Rishi, while not perhaps thought of as one of the greatest Commons orators, when he's, on the money, as it were, can be very good and very effective.
In terms of shortness, I would believe that the best motto for speeches is be bold, be brief, be gone.
Yes.
But in relation to Rishi, that particular speech was the real Rishi unleashed at last,
yes,
without the straitjacket of being Prime Minister and the leader of the party during very difficult circumstances, where I felt that the straitjacket that he imposed on himself was far too tight, because it indeed did mean that the passion that he genuinely felt, especially about economic matters, wasn't really projected in the right direction all the time. But passion for him, when it's genuine passion as opposed to created passion, is what you see when Rishi Sunak is at his best. It's what you see when he's finished his journey from hedge fund manager to passionate politician, which took quite a while.
And you make the point that people go on a journey, people improve, people find their true voice. It might seem odd that you need someone else to help you find your true voice, but of course, when you're speaking formally, when you're speaking in Parliament, it's different from a conversation. Of all the politicians with whom you've worked, who are the politicians whom you've seen most dramatically transform, whether it's from reticent to roaring like a lion, or from fumbling to being articulate and on top of things?
Rishi is certainly one of them, because when he was doing hedge fund management in California in the early part of this century, I think that the only presentations he would be doing would be around a ballroom table using lots of PowerPoint. Very dry, very precise, very specific, very numbers oriented. And so the whole transition from that to speaking to 150 activists in Uttoxeter on a dark Sunday afternoon was really quite a sharp one. And it was something that he found very strange for quite a while. But he is somebody who's not just a banker, not just a politician. He's a student, he's a learner, he's an academic. And he learned to each stage very quickly. And it was a relatively short period of time, from about 6 months from him not knowing anything about how to speak to a Tory audience, to suddenly absolutely rampaging through and winning by a long way the candidacy for William Hague's old seat.
And are there some politicians who simply are not susceptible to improvement? So, you're like a golf professional, you're attempting to get them to improve their swing, but actually they're stuck in a rut. And no matter what you say, or no matter what you point them to, it's impossible for them to get beyond a certain base level of competence.
If you're going to engage a presentation coach and you're a politician, it has to be your decision and not that of your advisors bullying you into doing it. You've got to really want to do it. You've got to really be prepared to spend the time doing it, and you've got to be prepared to use the new techniques under pressure, under the pressure of actual gunfire. So it's something there has to be a desire for. But another way of looking at it is this. Politics is a very important profession, and it's one of the very few important professions that doesn't have a rigorous training structure, building up to rigorous exams, and then some form of certificate, unlike becoming a doctor, lawyer, accountant. And it's strange, isn't it, that somehow the profession of being a politician, you're expected to sort of learn it on the job and be naturally good at it. Well, I discovered this over a long period of time, that quite a lot of politicians, I think the actual majority, don't actually enjoy public speaking. They see it as a necessary evil to have to go through. And they certainly don't enjoy being interviewed on television. And so even more, I would suggest they need coaching. And the other thing about the attitude to coaching in politics is that people often see it as a one-off inoculation that works for the rest of your life. Oh, he's had 2 hours of media training. He's been media trained, and therefore that lasts forever. But really, in order to continually improve and to deal with different circumstances, the outside objectivity of an independent coach is important.
And sometimes there'll be some people who say, well, there's something fake then about all this coaching. If you've got someone who is continually deferring to an outside expert or guide to get them to speak in a particular way, to produce these micro messages and so on, then what they're doing is they're crushing their own spontaneity, and they're becoming simply a soundbite generating machine, manipulated by a Svengali. What would you say to those people who would say that presentation coaching, voice coaching, media training is actually a way of crushing authenticity and turning politicians into automata?
Coaching is a way of enhancing and turbocharging authenticity so that you come across as your real self with your real views under pressure, but in a sharper, more honed, more brief, more punchy sort of way. Novak Djokovic, going back to the coaching analogy, he won, 25 Open titles, and now in the last stage of his career, he's engaged a coach, not to teach him how to do a backhand or a forehand again, but to adapt to the situation whereby his body isn't as effective as it used to be, and he needs to be having different tactics and possibly different solutions on the pitch. And that is the same for politicians as well.
And so you can't take someone who is naturally maladroit or naturally passionate and turn them into something else. So the passion will always come through, or if someone just isn't good at public speaking, there's only a limit to what you can do in order to get them to be effective.
There is a limit, but I can certainly take somebody who is quite a poor speaker and absolutely hates it to being really quite competent and competent enough to where they want to be. You see, to be a backbench MP or to be a junior minister, you don't need to be a combination of Cicero and Jerry Seinfeld. You need to be able to convey a certain number of precisely prepared words under pressure. Now, once you get to a front bench and once you're getting to run for leader, that's when all aspects of public speaking need to be focused. And when I say public speaking, in fact, I would say the word presentation as an overall umbrella, because it runs from doing a keynote speech to 2,000 people to doing a one-to-one interview on local radio.
And Donald Trump, of course, is perhaps the preeminent political communicator of our time. He is a style perhaps unlike anyone else's. But in a way, his preparation, his apprenticeship, literally, was presenting that reality TV show, The Apprentice, in the US. And he learnt then the importance of pith, and also the importance of being able to accurately sum up a weakness in someone's character or a weakness in an argument and to go for the jugular there. Do you think that Trump's own particular style is shaped primarily by The Apprentice and the experience that he got there? Or is there something more to him, which is just stardust?
Trump moved from pith to taking it
Yes.
during the course of his presentational career.
Yes.
Yes, I believe that he certainly discovered that once he did the apprentice experiment, that he loved it. He loved being in the public eye. It gave him a big kick, a bigger kick than just being a very rich man. And eventually he realised that perhaps he could have enough of a distinctive take on politics to want to enter it himself. I don't think he necessarily believed he could win in 2016, and it was a slow process that he went through in order to have self-belief. But what he did, especially during that first campaign, was to have concepts in his head and then riff off them, which I would not recommend to any other human being in the world. Because instead of going in a straight line from this starting premise through this piece of evidence, this macro message, and then on to a conclusion, he would go all over the place.
Weave, yes.
The weave. But it was a weave that, on his own supporters, had the effect of, that snake in Jungle Book with the eyes revolving.
Oh, yes.
And they'd be utterly hypnotised by him. That's a technique that wouldn't work for anyone else. And you see, Michael, even yourself, there was a time when you would just go through concepts in your head, I believe, and even sometimes speaking at Tory party conference, you would do a speech, I believe, without ever having written down a script.
Yes.
Which meant that sometimes you were brilliant, But forgive me for saying this, sometimes you were not brilliant.
Oh, no, absolutely.
And you were always brilliant once you'd prepared a script, the script was edited, it was looked at again by you, edited again, and then you rehearsed it. Somebody who's really good spontaneously is always going to be even better when they're prepared.
Yes, and one of the things that I felt when I was a politician and giving speeches is that I often thought, if you don't have a script, but you know broadly what it is that you want to say, then you will come across as more authentic. Actually, however, because it comes from the heart, it can be the case that your effectiveness is impeded because sometimes you're trying to reach in your memory or in your mind for what the next step in the argument is. Even if you know it instinctively, the sheer nerve-wracking nature of being on a stage means that you have to work all the harder to get things from the short and the long-term memory back. And again, without wanting to be fair or unfair on any particular individual, when Robert Jenrick gave his speech at the Tory Party conference this year, it was very well constructed. And indeed, he delivered it without a note, which is a formidable feat of memory. But I felt sorry for him in a way because I thought that in so doing, the sheer effort of remembering everything took something away from the punch if he'd had the script in front of him and therefore was able to work over and over again on delivery. I don't know if you think that's fair.
I do think it's fair. You could tell from the way that Robert Jenrick delivered that speech, and indeed the speech at his launch event many weeks previously in his constituency, that what he was doing was thinking up 3 or 4 words at a time from his learnt script, which meant that he was putting all of his effort into remembering his script rather than the effort into the appropriate passion and making sure that he is emotionally engaged with the audience. The other thing is, I've got to say, if you don't mind, learning a script, so what?
Yes.
It's been done before. In Birmingham, there is a magnificent, the Birmingham ICC, there is a magnificent piece of presentation kit, which wasn't used properly by the party because it was feeling a little bit penny pinching at the time during the last party conference, where there were 2 plasma screens at the back. Certainly used very effectively by Kemi Badenoch, and they're big letters, they are impossible not to see, and they give you freedom with your script and allow you to express emotion as well as precision. Not to use that technology is crazy. Who gives brownie points for memorising something? I can tell you one audience that did, and that was the audience at Party Conference in 2005, where David Cameron did his 15-minute pitch, 15 minutes being given to every candidate, and he did it without notes, and it did have a big wow factor at the time. But frankly, Cameron had been writing that speech not for hours, but for probably years in advance.
Completely. And the thing is that David had and has an ability to vary pace and tone, to move from the intimate and conversational to the passionate and rhetorically forceful. He is a natural who has had years of practice and thought and worked as an apprentice to other Conservative politicians before becoming a front-rank politician himself. If you were to look at the range of politicians that we have now in the House of Commons, Labour, Conservative, Liberal, Democrat, Reform, whatever, who do you think? They're naturals. Maybe they could do better. Maybe with your help or someone else's. Leonie Mellinger, who knows? They could be even more effective. But who do you think, even if they're not yet fully at the top of their game, are the people who you think communicate well, whether it's on television or in the House of Commons?
First of all, I don't believe there is such a thing as a natural.
No.
Because public speaking is such an unnatural activity. Answering questions in front of a TV camera is also an unnatural activity. You see, the thing is, when we are talking, we have a unspoken covenant with the people who we're talking to, whether it's one person or 10 people around a dinner table, that we will say something and then they will say something. We will say something, then they will say something. We're all natural conversationalists, communicators. It becomes unnatural when the rules change to, there are 2,000 of you sitting there, I'm now going to speak for half an hour, uninterrupted, and you're not going to say anything back to me. That is quite literally an unnatural situation. And of course, here I am. We've got lights up here. We've got cameras. We've got microphones. This is a very specific sort of situation, but it's not you and me having a chat over a drink. And so there is no such thing as a natural. There are people who've managed to hone their own skills without any outside coaching. And I can see people even going on a journey on their front benches at the moment. The Deputy Prime Minister has a particular style which doesn't particularly appeal to everybody. But the fact that she does have a very distinctive, striking regional accent, which I share to a certain extent myself, and the way that she finds certain distinctive phrases and a certain aggressive attitude that fires up the people behind her, works very well for her in small doses. But it can become grating very quickly. Frankly, in terms of the Labour front bench, she is the only one that stands out.
Well, the one with personality. Angela Rayner is the one with the most personality.
Yes.
People talk about Wes Streeting as being a good communicator and Shabana Mahmood and so on. But your sense would be that however skilled they are as politicians, they don't have the sense of cut-through that Angela Rayner has.
Correct. Wes Streeting is an interesting communicator because he has this amazing technique which politicians very rarely use. Sometimes he admits when he's wrong. I remember once when he was asked one of those gotcha questions by Kunsberg, he said, okay, what are Keir Starmer's 5 basic principles? And he said, number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. And then Kunsberg said, and number 5? And he said, well, you've got me there. Can't remember the 5th. I'm bound to be sacked tomorrow morning.
Yes.
And that was very, very endearing. And I think it's that endearing nature about him that means that he can challenge or say things that occasionally look as if they're against mainstream Labour policy.
One person we haven't touched on, neither Labour nor Conservative, who often does speak without notes and from the heart, is Nigel Farage. How do you rate him as a communicator?
Nigel Farage is a cross between politics and show business. I am pretty sure that he does indeed write scripts very precisely in advance, mainly on his own, probably without much outside help, but he hones them.
Yes.
You can tell that he doesn't repeat himself when he's on stage. He only says a particular thing once, but if he will repeat that particular thing deliberately if repetition is needed. But you can tell that he knows how to manipulate or more kindly persuade an audience. He uses pauses at the appropriate moment. He engages with his eyes with the whole of the room and the camera. And also he knows, he's not a comedian, but he knows how to get a laugh. He is somebody that is box office. There are very few people that you would pay, let's say, 30 quid or 50 quid to go and see speak, but you would do for Nigel Farage.
Next up, Freddie Gray discusses the idea that it's America which really runs Britain with Angus Hanton.
Angus, there's sort of quite a lot of relief in British circles that Trump seems to be, for now, this could have all changed by the time this podcast comes out, you never know with Trump world, but Trump seems to be not considering Britain as a prime target for his tariffs. And he will be applying tariffs on the European Union, on steel and aluminium, quite large, 25% tariffs, very significant. But Britain, for now, appears to escape. Should we be relieved?
I don't think so. I think this is very early counting of chickens.
Yeah.
We're well under a month into Trump's presidency, and it's quite clear that he's changing the relationship between Britain and America so that instead of being a partnership with a senior and a junior partner, it's much more now a master-servant relationship. And that's what my book Vassal State illustrates, both in terms of politics, but also in terms of the economic realities that America owns so much, American corporations own so much of Britain. But in terms of our hopes for how we might be treated in this master-servant relationship in terms of tariffs, I think we have some reasons for optimism. First of all, we don't have a big trade surplus, in fact, any trade surplus at all with the US. And the US, Trump is really targeting those who have a surplus with him, with the US. So those are China, Canada, Mexico, and the EU. So in that sense, we should be out of the firing line. But I think we'll probably be caught in the crossfire. Tariffs, 25% tariffs on steel will affect British companies.
Well, and given from your book, you get the strong sense of how well America does out of Britain. I mean, in some senses, we should be having more of a protectionist attitude towards the US economy. Would you argue that?
Absolutely. I mean, America has had a Buy America policy, and it's had it for many years. Effectively, the Europeans have a Buy European or Buy France, Buy Germany policy, and we've decided not to do that. And our open economy has meant that we said everything's for sale. It's somewhat like a jumble sale, and there's still some stuff left on the shelves, not a vast amount. And one illustration of that was this week's news that Elliott, a New York-based company, is rattling the cage of British Petroleum, of BP, and there may well be an American takeover of one of the few British large companies.
Yeah. I had you on this podcast last year with William Clouston, the leader of the Social Democratic Party. And you were both saying pretty much there's no family silver left in Britain. British Petroleum arguably, but in terms of steel production, in terms of manufacturing industry, Britain doesn't really have an economy in that sense.
No, absolutely. We've sold so much of it. But I think what's not understood widely is that we've sold so much of it to the Americans. If you go into the street and ask the average person which country they think has done more takeovers, they'll say, well, probably China. But actually the US has taken over and owns 10 times as much of the UK economy. America owns 10 times as much as China does. So people just don't really understand the numbers. And it's partly because organisations like Boots, which are US owned, and Cisco and many of the defence companies, formerly Morrison's, and Manchester United, Chelsea, all these companies are owned by Americans, and people just don't realise the extent of American ownership. But I think what Trump does is he lays that bare, and he's saying quite brutally he's going to start using the power that the American corporations have. But it is true that tariffs on the UK may make US companies suffer as well. So to the extent that Britain represents a very big investment for America, it may want to protect its investment. I mean, of all America's overseas investments, 30% of them are in the UK. It's a huge proportion.
Well, I remember the writer Andy Bacevich said to me once that Trump, he's not a fan of Trump, but he said Donald Trump, the good thing about Donald Trump is he exposes all the smelly little hypocrisies of the way power works. And in some ways, that's what he will be doing to tariffs, with Britain in particular. He's much more clear and upfront about the nature of the relationship. America is the metropole and we are the outpost. And for a long time, we've just been in denial about this.
If you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you'll get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
Well, I think it's much worse than us being the outpost. I think we're much more subservient than people realise, and it's not just a static relationship. It's one in which the American corporations are increasingly taking over the UK. I mean, today we've seen an announcement by the British that they're going to join the Americans in not signing the artificial intelligence accord that the Europeans wanted. And therefore we're saying we're going with the Americans. We're allowing the Americans increasingly to take over new sectors. And we see that at the moment with AI. It's already dominated by US corporations.
Yes. And it's been Peter Mandelson started as ambassador in Washington yesterday. I think he's formally begun now, his ambassadorship. And there's a lot of gossip about him because he is very much this pro-EU figure, links to China and so on. And there was a big push on the right in America and in Britain to try and get him stopped from being ambassador. But I think a lot of people in Trump world and people in the Labour Party think he might be just the sort of figure that can kind of coax a good relationship for Britain out of the US.
One hopes so, but there's only so much you can do in terms of a sort of social relationship or a diplomatic relationship. The underlying facts are that in economic terms, we're dominated by the US, and they're continuing with the new technologies to become the dominant player in most market sectors.
And that's not something politics can change, really, or is it?
It absolutely can. I mean, the politicians, if they wanted to, they could have a buy British policy. They could protect against takeovers. They could do something very simple. They could start to measure the extent of US ownership. And I had to dig quite deep to find the numbers. There's no department, no part of government which is trying to say, let's work out how much of British economy is owned by Americans. So there's a lot they could do. If they wanted to, but I don't think they want to. I think when we talk about Atlanticist leaders, including Keir Starmer, we're talking about leaders who very much want to play to what the Americans want, and of course that applies to reform. Nigel Farage is very close to the Trump leadership, and it applies to the Conservative Party.
Well, and certainly on the right, there seems to be this understanding that you either sell out to China and get as much money in from China as you can, or you sell out to America. And I suppose a lot of people like me would prefer to sell out. If you're going to have to sell out to one, you'd prefer to sell out to America rather than,
But Freddie,
Leninists in Beijing.
But Freddie, that's the big if. If you have to sell out, and if you have to sell out to one of the big power blocks. I mean, the three big power blocks are surely America, China, and Europe. Yeah. Europe's 20 miles away. America's 2,000 miles away. We've got so much more that we should have in common with Europe, and indeed we have got it in common with Europe. So I wouldn't sell out to anyone, but if I were going to align myself, I would align myself with the EU. But you don't have to do that at the expense of having a good relationship with America. I mean, after all, the United States. I mean, after all, France and Germany are still under the NATO umbrella. They can protect their industries without having to go Chinese.
Well, this presumably is what Labour are thinking. There's going to be a big reset with Europe, a kind of a realignment with the European Union. It won't be a Remain policy. It won't be a re-entry into the European Union, but it'll be something as close as we can get to it while being outside.
Well, they'll do that with one arm held behind their back by the Americans, saying, you just do what we want. And today's announcement about the Artificial Intelligence Accord is one demonstration of that.
And on tech, America is the metropole. It is the superpower. And it's very hard for non-American countries to compete. Therefore, we are always going to be dominated by America because America is the alpha and omega when it comes to technology.
Well, that's right. When we refer to big tech, we should really be saying big US tech.
Yes.
But we don't have to be like that. I mean, the British owned DeepMind. They didn't have to let it be sold to Google. And there are European companies. Spotify is a Swedish company. There are technology companies, but the way we've allowed it to develop is when there's a successful UK tech company, it gets bought out, and we allow it to be bought out by the big US tech companies. And one of the things that Trump is doing is using his political and economic power to help the big tech companies. So they're already paying at maximum 15% tax, and actually I think they're paying less than that, whereas UK companies pay 25% tax. But it's been suggested this in the last week that as part of a trade deal, the digital services tax, in other words, the tax on tech companies, would be dropped completely. So I think this power that we're speaking of is being exercised to help big tech.
Well, we saw in Britain with the debate over the Online Safety Act that any attempt of the government to kind of control the power of technology meets fierce resistance and ends up losing, possibly because these tech companies are so powerful. And indeed, the American stock market, to some extent, is big tech now. It is, all the bets are on technology, AI, Nvidia, and so on. These are all huge tech bets that are driving the American economy forward.
Absolutely. I mean, the trillion-dollar companies are almost all tech companies, and they're almost all American, and they're dominated by sort of the big 5 or 6, Amazon, Apple, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and of course now Nvidia, they've got a terrific amount of power that reaches right into our lives, into our phones, and into our politics. So that Twitter is described, or X is described as the town square, but it's basically a town square that dominates British politics, but is controlled from California, and that's also true, as you say, of standards in relation to security and privacy. And what Facebook and Instagram and the online platforms are allowed to do. It's controlled from California and not as it should be from Westminster.
And tech is now money. Tech is, through the digitization of money, tech is now money. And there's a fascinating bit in your book about how the sort of wiring of the economy, the payments wiring of the economy, is now channeled through America now. Can you explain a bit about how that works?
Absolutely. I mean, the death of cash was something that was accelerated by COVID, but it's now quite relatively unusual to use cash. And so we're using cards. But those cards are American, so Visa and MasterCard, Google Pay, Apple Pay, Amex. These are all US payment systems, so that it means that almost every transaction that we make involves a royalty payment to an American corporation. And it's not just about payments. I mean, that's certainly true, but it's also other transactions that go through platforms. So if we book an Airbnb or if we sell something secondhand, we'll be using eBay, and we'll be using an American platform. So there's a friction on the whole economy that whenever a transaction is made, either both through payments and through platforms, the Americans are taking a royalty from trade, where it's one British person dealing with another British person, but a little bit's taken every time by US corporations.
And indeed, the sort of vestiges of the cash economy are actually controlled by America too, because they control the cash points now.
Absolutely. Once you've got a control of the, it's been put very well by a former chief of Visa Corporation, American. He said, we want to be involved in every transaction. So whether it's cash or more likely a card payment or even a debit card payment, they want to be involved, and they've made sure that they're critical to the way the financial system works.
Going back to Trump, there is sort of optimism in some parts of the right that Britain can use its status outside the European Union, but close to the European Union, to become a kind of very important middleman between America and Europe and America and the rest of the world. I mean, we are to some extent already. But do you think that's blue sky thinking that ignores the fundamental realities of the US takeover of the British economy?
I think the Americans are quite happy for their servant to put on the uniform of a butler and to be an introducer and a peacemaker, but it doesn't change the fundamental reality that the typical British household is paying to US corporations' profits £2,000 a year, and that's a transfer every year from British households to American corporations, and it tends to get bigger each year.
Well, again, on this idea that Donald Trump sort of clarifies things, he's now talking more in imperial terms about controlling the Western Hemisphere more, Canada, Panama, Mexico, exerting America's influence in a more traditional power way, almost a revisionist way. Some people in his circle, Elon Musk, seems to be very interested in Britain. I mean, perhaps we are just going to be absorbed into the American system of government over the next 50 to 100 years.
Well, that 50 to 100 years is looking a long way ahead, but in the next 4 years, it certainly looks as if America's going to take much more interest in British politics. And this is breaking a really strong convention not to interfere in each other's domestic politics. And Musk has broken that very fully. And it seems to me that Trump has done so when he rather patronisingly said that Keir Starmer is doing a good job so far.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me this sort of comment it has traditionally not been made. There's been supportive comments, but not this kind of judgmental comment with the implicit threat that if he doesn't do a good job, Trump will interfere.
Well, the Brexiteer counterpoint to that would be that Barack Obama famously said, if you leave the European Union, you'll be joining the back of the queue. And that triggered an angry response on the right in Britain, didn't it?
Absolutely, yes. Well, that is the risk that we're... And I mean, we haven't had a trade deal for several years now, and the British government, successive British governments, have been very keen to have a trade deal, and the Americans hold that over us, in order to get what they want in terms of regulation and in other respects. So, yeah, we are at the back of the queue, but I'm afraid we've put ourselves there.
If Britain were to try to develop some kind of protectionist policies to protect our big companies, one law you mentioned in France is the so-called Danone law, which was introduced, I think, to stop a US private equity takeover of Danone, which is a huge French company.
It was to stop PepsiCo taking over the basically milk and yogurt company.
Exactly. You would like to see something like that in Britain, but again, what's really left?
Well, what the French did was with the Danone law was they said that this Danone is a national strategic company, and it's important that it's French owned. And in a way, they were right, because the company supports small communities by buying milk from small farmers. And it doesn't have a policy of raw profit maximisation. It has stakeholders, and it's concerned about its employees and its communities. So I think, yes, we've fundamentally, British companies have somewhat different values than American companies. American companies have been all about profit maximisation at all costs. And I think British and European companies have a different culture, a belief that, yes, profit is important, and they are interested in making money, but employees are important, and customers are important, and communities are important, and the long term is important. So I think there's a culture clash in business, and I think if we go the American way, we're accepting the private equity willingness to sack anyone who's not making a profit, even in the short term, and to gear up with borrowing and to just maximise financial returns to the financial engineers.
Is this what the British Chancellor Rachel Reeves would call securonomics? You would go along with that? You think there is an economic vision for Britain that could be more stable, long-term, social democratic in the future? Absolutely.
If we boil it down just to making money, then a lot of people will lose their jobs needlessly. But in terms of Rachel Reeves's approach, I'm very disappointed in her not being more interested in British business, so that when she announced a great success in getting investment in the UK, it was very much investment by big tech companies and not investment by British companies themselves.
Yeah, I take that point, but is it not just the reality of the financial waters that we're all swimming in, that now big tech is everything?
Well, there are lots of different ways to deal with that. It would be reasonable for the government to say that they want to charge the same tax on big tech's profits as they charge on UK companies' profits. And it would be reasonable for them to say we want to have much more say in regulation about what information, how the platforms work.
And do you think that should be applied to services as much as manufacturing? I mean, we are a service-based economy, really, aren't we? And that's where America is so strong, if you look at the city, finance, and so on.
Well, they're also strong in manufacturing. I mean, many people who are getting their Wi-Fi sorted out are using Starlink from Elon Musk's company, and there's a lot of manufacturing in the US. I mean, people just forget how big the US is. I mean, in terms of the total GDP, there's something like 29 trillion, and the whole of Europe is something like 20 trillion. So they're about 50% more than the whole of Europe. So they're big, and that's services and goods.
And the US economy is, I take your point that it's just always been about profit maximisation, and you don't have the same culture in Europe and Britain perhaps. But it's primed for growth, and it does do that. It grows. Britain, growth is this sort of unicorn that we seem to be chasing and unable to find. Don't we need a bit more of the American attitude to growth?
I think we've got a lot to learn from the Americans, of course, that they run businesses very well, and we should do a lot more of the things that they do. And yes, we do try to learn from them, but that doesn't mean we have to swallow their philosophy hook, line, and sinker. We can be much more like the Americans or the Germans or the French in saying, "Yep, we've got to learn." A bit like after the Second World War with Le Défi Américain, the American challenge that was written by Jean-Jacques Schreiber, and he argued that the French needed to learn American business methods, and they did so, and very successfully. So we can learn American business methods without selling out to them.
Yes. Has it been about a year since Vassal State came out?
Vassal State came out last April.
And coming up to a year.
Yes.
And in that time, do you think we've moved it more into vassalage, or are we seeing a way out?
I'm afraid we've moved more into vassalage, particularly the disappointment of the new Labour government not being at all concerned about any economic nationalism, and secondly, Donald Trump being so keen to push American advantage into American dominance.
Professor John Mearsheimer was back on the channel to discuss how President Trump's plans for Gaza might work. He joins us now with Freddie Gray.
John, I'll start by asking you, what are your sort of broad brush impressions of Trump's foreign policy in his second term? Has it differed in any way to what you expected?
I think that basically what Trump is trying to do at this point in time is to sort of create chaos on all fronts, make a number of wild assertions, put forward policy ideas that are never going to be realized. And I think the hope on his part is that out of all this chaos that he's creating, he can come up with some sort of formidable grand strategy that solves all the big problems that the United States and the West faces, and in the end, fashion a coherent grand strategy that deals with these different problems. But at this point in time, what we really have is him making a lot of, I think it's fair to say, wild and crazy statements. I mean, the idea that Canada is going to become the 51st state, that we're going to take back the Panama Canal, that we're going to grab Greenland, that the United States is going to go into Gaza and ethnically cleanse the Palestinians and then turn it into the Riviera of the Middle East. Well, all these ideas are basically outlandish. And you would not expect, a new president to start off by making a whole set of comments like that. And at the same time, and we can talk more about this, I don't think he's done much of anything to fix the Middle East problem, and this is mainly the Gaza problem at this point in time, or the Ukraine problem. You want to remember, he said that he was going to come in and solve the Ukraine problem in one day, and that maybe even solve it before he moved into the White House. We can talk about this again, but if anything, it looks to me like we're in more trouble on Ukraine than we were before he became the president. So I'm not too sure how this all works out in the end. He may have a grand strategy in mind that escapes me, and we may live happily ever after. But at this point in time, it sure doesn't look that way.
Can I try and put a small point in Trump's defense? When you say he's proposing ethnically cleansing Palestinians, has he actually done that?
Has he done that?
Yeah.
No, and he's not going to be able to do it. That's my point.
No, but has he proposed that?
Yes, he's talked about pushing the Palestinians, all of the Palestinians. By my count, there were, before this conflict started on October 7th, there were about 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza. And he's talking about clearing them all out. And that would have to be done at the end of a rifle barrel. Those people are not going to leave. He has not said that he was going to push them out at the end of a rifle barrel, but that is implicit in what he says. But he's committed to getting rid of those people, and he's now said that they're not welcome back. In the beginning, when he first raised this idea, he talked about pushing them out maybe temporarily. But now that's been taken off the table, and the idea is that they're going to be pushed out permanently, and he's going to find new homes for them in places like Jordan and Egypt.
Well, I want to get onto Gaza a bit more later, but if we could stick for now with the broad brush points. You're a realist. You are probably the world's leading expert on realism in international relations. Does it not strike you that perhaps Trump is a much more realist foreign policy president than his predecessors? He is asserting, or trying to assert, control over the Western Hemisphere in a more direct and open way than others. And he is transactional and pragmatic in his approach to Ukraine and the Middle East. His tariffs are are direct and strike me as faintly realistic in some ways. Certainly not in terms of the economics, but in terms of the hard power dynamics. What do you make of what I'm saying?
I think there's no question, Freddie, that he definitely has realist instincts. You want to remember that when he became president in 2017, he immediately abandoned engagement with China and switched to a containment policy. And indeed, he campaigned on abandoning engagement and moving toward containment in 2016. And I believe that's a very realist policy. He's also made the argument that all these terrible forever wars should have never happened, and that he was going to end them, and that he was not going to engage in any more forever wars. Given those policy positions, I applaud him. I think he was on the money. But what we're talking about now is how he is acting since he moved into the White House on January 20th. What exactly is his grand strategy? And I think that at this point in time, it looks like it's hard to say exactly how he's going to pursue those broad realist goals. And I think, if anything, it looks remarkably chaotic. If you made me president of the United States, we don't have to worry about that ever happening, I would not have come into office and started talking about, annexing Canada, taking back the Panama Canal, and so forth and so on. I would have put all my attention on trying to shut down the Gaza conflict once and for all, and also trying to shut down the Ukraine conflict once and for all. Those should be the highest priority issues. And I don't think that he has paid much attention to Ukraine. And with regard to Gaza, I think that his proposal to ethnically cleanse Gaza and turn it into the Riviera of the Middle East is really crazy, and is not going to help the situation. So he may have realist instincts. This is your point. And he may be a marked improvement on his predecessor and his predecessors in this regard. I'm not going to argue against that. But in terms of how he's actually performed in the first 3 weeks, and we do want to be aware of the fact that he's only been president for 3 weeks, and that's a very short period of time. So you don't want to pass final judgment. But I would just say, I don't think he's off to a good start.
How much weight do you put on rhetoric or words or messaging when you study things from a realist point of view? I mean, could you not say that what Trump says is less important than what America actually does? And of course, rhetoric and bluster is clearly part of his modus operandi.
Well, I think there's no question that a lot of what he says, everybody recognizes it doesn't mean very much in and of itself. In other words, no, I don't think anybody believes Canada is going to become the 51st state, or that we're going to invade Panama anytime soon. So I think there's no question that people understand that a lot of this is just bluster. It's the way Trump operates, and he does it at the domestic level as well as the foreign policy level. But the point I would make to you, Freddie, is I do think words matter. And I think if you look at all the different things that he's been saying to different audiences, it's not clear that this is very helpful. And we don't want to get into the Ukraine case in great detail at this point in time. But if you look at Ukraine, he said a number of things to the Russians that are quite offensive and are not going to engender trust in him among Russian elites, especially Putin. And I think moving forward, if anything, he wants to do everything he can to create a situation where Trump is trusted by Putin. But if you look at what he says and how he says it, I don't think he's helping his cause. Trump is helping his cause. So words do matter, even for realists. And I think in that regard, he's not been terribly smart.
Do you think that the Israelis have a point when they say that Trump is thinking out of the box? This is what Netanyahu says, and that is constructive, because there are no other viable solutions for what to do about Gaza. And when it comes to the Palestinians, attempts to accommodate them, attempts to find some kind of compromise have always failed, going back to 1948.
You're asking me, is there a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that's been there and we've just missed? The answer is no. There was no way you were going to solve this one, because the Israelis from the beginning have wanted all of Greater Israel. They were never interested in giving the Palestinians a state of their own. This is a myth that we purvey in the West so that we can support Israel fully. So it's not like I think there is a solution out there, a viable solution. The best that the Israelis were able to come up with was where they basically locked the Palestinians in Gaza in a giant open air prison, and they thought they could manage that problem. And that looked like it worked up until October 7th. And now the question is, what do you do moving forward? And the Israelis would like to cleanse Gaza. That's been their policy goal since October 7th, to cleanse Gaza. They want to get rid of all the Palestinians. The question is, do you think this is a viable or an ethical solution? I don't think it's a viable solution, because I don't think the Palestinians are going to leave. You want to remember that the Israelis have just spent the past 16 months executing what I call a genocide in Gaza. They have murdered huge numbers of Palestinians. By almost all accounts, they've made the place unlivable. It's really quite remarkable when you see the destruction that they have wrought in Gaza. And nevertheless, the Palestinians are still there, and Hamas, by Israeli accounts and by Tony Blinken's account, is alive and well. So what are we going to do now to fix the problem? What's the viable solution that Trump has? What does this thinking outside of the box add up to? There's no question he's thinking outside of the box, but is what he is thinking logical? Is it viable? Is it morally correct? I don't think it's any of those things. I, as an American, certainly don't want to be associated with a policy that calls for ethnically cleansing Gaza at the end of a rifle barrel. Furthermore, I don't think you can do it. The Israelis were unable to do it. I don't think we're going to be able to do it. Trump has made it clear we're not going to go in there and do it. So who's going to do it? The Israelis? Well, they've already tried. What do you think they've been doing for the past 15 months? This is like, people say, if the hostages don't come back on Saturday, these are the Israeli hostages who are due to be released this Saturday. If they don't come back, Netanyahu is going to restart the war. And I say to myself, okay, what does that mean? The war was not going very well, which is why the Israelis agreed to the ceasefire. They didn't agree to the ceasefire because Trump put great pressure on them. They agreed to the ceasefire in large part because the IDF, the Israeli military, put great pressure on Netanyahu to effect the ceasefire, because the IDF understood it could not defeat Hamas, number one, and number two, the Israeli army was coming apart at the seams. It was suffering great casualties in Gaza, and furthermore, that this is an army that's configured for fighting short wars, not long wars. It was not configured to fight a war of attrition over a long period of time in Gaza. So it was in deep trouble. So the Israelis agreed to a ceasefire. And now we're talking about putting an end to that ceasefire. Okay, what's the magic formula that the Israelis have now come up with that's going to allow them to deal with the Hamas problem that they couldn't deal with for the first 16 months of the war? I just don't understand. So, Trump is thinking outside the box, but sometimes thinking outside the box makes sense and sometimes it doesn't. And in this case, I don't think it makes sense.
I want to go back a little bit to where you said that the Israelis have always wanted a greater Israel. Isn't that a pretty controversial thing to say and perhaps unfair, given that there may be politicians in Israel today who wanted greater Israel and have done for a long time, But Israel as a state has not always acted as though it has wanted a greater Israel. It has sought accommodation with the Palestinians, and it has been rebuffed.
No, I don't believe that. I believe these are myths that we tell ourselves in the West so that we can continue to support Israel down the line. I think the original Zionists, the people who were interested in creating a Jewish state, which of course happened in May of 1948, understood full well that they could not take all the territory at once, simply because there were so many Palestinians in the area and not nearly as many Jews, and it would have to be done incrementally. But the idea that the Israelis were interested in a meaningful two-state solution, and it was the Palestinians who rejected those wholly generous offers by the Israelis, is a tall tale. And I know we tell it in the West, and when I make the argument that I'm making, people think that, I'm an anti-Semite or I'm hostile to Israel and so forth and so on. But there's a whole literature written by Israelis that makes it clear that the Israelis were never interested in creating a Palestinian state, and they wanted all of Israel. They just understood that they'd have to do it gradually. They wouldn't be able to take all that territory all at once.
Yeah, well, I would never accuse you of anti-Semitism, although I know a lot of people do. But let's get back to Trump rather than getting into a discussion of Middle Eastern politics, because what a lot of people are speculating, and this certainly looks like it might be playing out now, is that what Trump was trying to do was pressure the neighbouring Arab states to come up with viable solutions of their own, possibly rebuilding Gaza themselves, paying for it, and possibly trying to look after some of the Palestinian people who have been displaced. Jordan seems to be rebuffing Trump a bit more forcefully at the moment, whereas Egypt has suggested that it would like to come up with a reconstruction plan for Gaza. So perhaps this is bluster from Trump that is working, that's achieving leverage over those Arab states.
I don't believe that at all. It's actually united the Arab states in the region. There's universal agreement among the Arab states and universal agreement in the Arab and Islamic world that this is morally reprehensible, that this is the Palestinians' land, that the United States and Israel have absolutely no right to push them out, and in no way are they going to accommodate the United States and Israel. We're isolated on this one. I'm sure the Europeans are with us on this. For the most part. But outside of the Europeans, there's no support for what the United States wants to do in this case. The last thing Jordan wants is to create a huge enclave for more Palestinians inside its borders, and Egypt is thinking the same way. Look, the fact is the United States is remarkably powerful. And it has tremendous leverage over Egypt and Jordan, because in the past, we worked out a deal with Egypt and Jordan where we would give them huge amounts of financial aid if they played nice with Israel. We bought off for Israel. We did this for Israel. We bought off Jordan and Egypt. Again, there's a huge literature on this. This is not something I'm making up. But once we do that, not only do we guarantee at the time that Egypt and Jordan will play nice with Israel, but it gives us huge leverage over time. And Trump fully understands that. And he's basically telling the Jordanians and the Egyptians, we have huge economic leverage over you. And we're going to use that leverage to force you. We're going to coerce you into accepting the Palestinians. And the question you have to ask yourself is whether or not the Jordanians and the Egyptians will cave. And the Jordanians made it clear yesterday. The Jordanian president made it clear in a tweet after his meeting with Trump that that's not going to happen. And Sisi, General Sisi, the Egyptian leader, canceled his trip to Washington because he doesn't want to be humiliated by Trump. And he wants to make it clear that he's not going to go along either. So you have a situation here, Freddie. The Palestinians are not going to leave. The Egyptians are not going to take them. The Jordanians are not going to take them. And then you have to ask yourself a simple question: where does that leave us?
Well, I would say, I'd go back to that point that the Egyptians are saying that they're going to propose a redevelopment plan for Gaza. And to some extent, Trump's move has exposed a certain hypocrisy among the Arab states, which is that there is an astronomical bill to fix Gaza, which neighbouring states are not willing to pay. And yet they are willing to condemn Israel, to condemn the United States. They're not willing to take part in any solutions. Trump is pushing them into coming up with solutions.
Freddie, why should the neighboring states pay for what Israel and the United States did in Gaza?
Because as a realist, you should accept that it's in their regional interest.
It's not in their regional interest at all.
Why not?
The United States and Israel destroyed Gaza. The Israelis were executing a genocide. I mean, Trump sits there with Netanyahu and they talk about Gaza now being unlivable, and they talk about all the destruction in Gaza and the fact that the Palestinians cannot live there. It has been so thoroughly wrecked. And then the question is, who wrecked Gaza? Who did this? And the answer is the Israelis. Benjamin Netanyahu sitting right next to Trump, and Netanyahu did it in cahoots with Joe Biden and the West, and especially the United States. We should pay for rebuilding Gaza. The Israelis should pay for rebuilding Gaza. It's the Israelis and the Americans who destroyed Gaza, not the Egyptians or the Jordanians.
If you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you'll get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
Well, speaking of the United States paying for rebuilding Gaza, that is what Trump is proposing. So if we take his proposal at face value, a lot of people who support Trump, or a lot of people who voted for Trump, I'd say, did not imagine that occupying Gaza, which is what he's proposing, he said it repeatedly now, would be part of the foreign policy agenda. And in fact, it goes against what he's appeared to stand for in both elections, in all three elections, presidential elections that he's fought, which is America first, and not getting entangled in the Middle East, or further entangled in the Middle East. This would be a huge entanglement, would it not?
Yeah, I've seen a number of tweets from people who identify with the MAGA agenda, protesting what Trump is doing, saying, what is he doing here? My response to that is Trump's proposal on Gaza is not a serious proposal. The United States is not going to ethnically cleanse Gaza and then turn it into the Riviera of the Middle East. This is about as likely as Canada becoming the 51st state. Trump likes to bluster. He likes to make all of these outrageous statements, and then everybody pays huge amounts of attention to these statements, and they never add up to much. You remember when he fell in love with the North Koreans, and he was going to solve that problem. Get rid of North Korean nuclear weapons. How well did that work out? The answer is not very well at all. And this one's not going to work out very well either. This is a giant problem. And by the way, Freddie, Trump played an important role in fashioning the ceasefire that took place on January 19th. This is the Gaza ceasefire that took place on January 19th, which, of course, is the day before he moved into the White House. He sent his mediator, his Middle East mediator, Steve Witkoff, to the Middle East to basically tell Netanyahu, let's get a ceasefire. So it looked like Trump was off to a good start, right? We got a ceasefire in Gaza. And most people, not Netanyahu and company, but most people thought that was all for the good. But since he moved into the White House on January 20th, he's cut in the other direction. And if anything, he's done all he can to undermine the ceasefire agreement. And in my opinion, that doesn't make sense from his point of view, because a ceasefire and trying to work out some sort of meaningful modus vivendi with Israel and the Palestinians is a much smarter thing to do than try to turn Gaza into the Riviera in the Middle East.
Do you think, though, it does make sense from Trump's point of view that perhaps he knew that he had angered the Israelis, he'd angered Netanyahu, and that even perhaps beforehand he'd agreed with Netanyahu that he would change his position later? He angered them in the ceasefire, and he changed his position later to be more accommodating to Israel once he was in power, having achieved this ceasefire on the eve of his inauguration.
Yeah, I think that's a very smart observation, and I think you're probably right. But is there any hard evidence to support it? No, we don't know. And as you know, Trump is somebody who says one thing 1 minute and then says the exact opposite a minute later. So it's hard to tell exactly what's going on. I mean, as I said at the top of the show, I do think that Trump is into sowing chaos, and he operates on the assumption that if you sow chaos, that this will help him, to develop a solution to the various problems, or develop solutions to the various problems that the United States faces around the world. And maybe that's what's going on here. Maybe he's just bent on, saying different things on different days. I would note, though, Freddie, just very quickly, that to contradict myself, at first it looked like when he was talking about turning Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East, that he was just posturing and this was not serious. But it now looks like he really believes that he thinks that this is a meaningful policy position to hold, and that he, for the time being, is going to stick to it. I don't know how long he'll stick to it, because it ought to be quite apparent to him that he's not getting a lot of support in the Arab world, and that Hamas is not going to give up easily in Gaza, and he's going to have to force them out, the Palestinians, if he wants to put this grand plan of his into operation.
Isn't the real politique, if I can say that, here all about Iran, and that Witkoff, Trump and Netanyahu, they are aligned to an extent on what they want to do about Iran, and that just an hour before Trump's press office released a statement about the plan to take over Gaza, they released the agreement that Netanyahu and Trump seem to have reached on applying maximum pressure on Iran, on effectively pushing the Iranian regime as hard as they can.
No, I disagree with that. In fact, Haaretz had a headline story yesterday that made the point that what happened in Netanyahu's visit to the United States with regard to the Iranian issue was terrible news for Netanyahu. Netanyahu is not interested in maximum pressure. We've tried maximum pressure before. You want to remember that President Trump, in his first term, walked away from the nuclear arms agreement that the West and the Russians and the Chinese had fashioned with Iran. This is the famous JCPOA. That was the nuclear agreement. In 2018, Trump walked away from that, and Trump said that we're going to instead pursue a policy of maximum pressure to force Iran to agree to a better deal. Well, that failed. And what he's doing now is he is telling the Israelis, he's telling Netanyahu something he doesn't want to hear, which is that the United States is not planning on using military force to attack Iran. That's what Netanyahu wants. He wants the United States and Israel operating as a tag team to go in and blast the nuclear facilities in Iran. Trump has made it clear he has no interest in doing that, and instead he's going back to maximum pressure. The Israelis, of course, had to agree in public with Trump's policy position, but behind closed doors, they're adamantly opposed to it, which is why Haaretz had this headline yesterday saying that Netanyahu's position on Iran was undermined during his visit to Washington.
I take that point, but I suppose what I was getting at was the first Trump administration made some strides. It wasn't all just bluster and bluff in the Middle East. They did make some strides towards achieving the Abraham Accords, better negotiations between Arab states and Israel. And of course, the final piece of that puzzle, not the final piece, but a very important piece of that puzzle, will be an accord between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And that by applying maximum pressure on Iran, perhaps not going as far as Netanyahu wants, but they are pushing ahead with the process that they started in their first term.
I'm not sure what you're saying here. First of all, with regard to Iran, Iran is now enriching uranium up to 60% as a result of walking away from the JCPOA, as a result of Trump's policy, which was enthusiastically backed by Benjamin Netanyahu. We're now in a situation where Iran is about 2 weeks away from where it could enrich enough uranium for 4 or 5 bombs. 2 weeks away. To go from 60% enrichment to 90% enrichment is easy. That is saying that we are in much worse shape today with regard to a nuclear Iran than we were in 2018 when Trump walked away from the JCPOA. With regard to the Abraham Accords, I don't think the Abraham Accords matter for very much anyway. So there are these 4 Abraham Accords. What do they have to do with solving the Palestinian problem? What do they have to do with solving the Hezbollah problem? What do they have to do with solving the Syrian problem? What do they have to do with solving the Iranian problem? The answer is virtually nothing. So you have good relations between the UAE and Israel. You have good relations between Sudan and Morocco and Israel. Does this really matter? Were those countries at war and all of a sudden those wars were shut down by the Abraham Accords? I think not. And with regard to Saudi Arabia, if you read what the Saudis are now saying about Trump's plan to turn Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East, it's quite clear that we're further than ever from having an Abraham Accord with Saudi Arabia. Now, in the West, people like to talk about the fact that an Abraham Accord with Saudi Arabia is just around the corner. I would argue that if you look carefully at the evidence, that's not true at all. But even if you get an Abraham Accord with Saudi Arabia, what's the big deal? Is that going to help with all these different problems in places like Gaza, the West Bank, Hezbollah, Syria, and Iran? I think the answer is no.
Well, you said earlier that words matter. I would have thought accords matter, and diplomatic relations between countries being good matters because it's better than being bad.
The question, Freddie, is how much does it matter? And the answer is it doesn't matter very much at all. It matters for Saudi Arabia and Israel, but Saudi Arabia is not the big problem in the Middle East. We don't talk about the Saudi versus Israel conflict, right? Or the Sudan versus Israel conflict. We talk about places like Gaza, the West Bank, the Palestinians, Hezbollah, Iran, Syria. And these accords have little to do with those conflicts.
As we understand it, President Trump is quite concerned, or the people around him are quite concerned about an apparent Iranian threat to assassinate him. He said the other day that he's left instructions that if he is assassinated by Iran, there will be all hell to pay, or words to that effect. I mean, I think Trump might be more willing to nuke Tehran than you're willing to grant.
Well, he has made it very clear that he does not want to, quote him, bomb the hell out of Iran. You want to remember that he was elected in 2016 and he was elected again in 2024 on the platform that he was not going to start any more wars. That's the realist in Trump, and I think that's all for the good. I think there's no question if it was clear that Iran assassinated President Trump, and let's hope that never happens. Let's hope he's never assassinated, period. But if there was clear evidence that Iran assassinated Trump as president, there's no question whether Trump left orders or not that his successor would make Iran pay a god-awful price. There's just no question about that. But there's no evidence that Iran is trying to assassinate Trump that I know of. If there's evidence, they can show it to me, and then I'll believe it. But I don't think that Iran would be crazy enough to assassinate Trump. They surely can figure out what the consequences would be for them, and they would not be good. And therefore, I don't think they're out to assassinate Trump. So I think this is much to do about nothing.
There are some people who think, contrary to what I've been saying before, that Trump's agenda is to actually, go to Tehran at some point to surprise everyone by fashioning some kind of agreement with Iran, as he did with Kim Jong-un and North Korea in his first term, and perhaps as Nixon did with China. He sees himself as somebody who's capable of breaking these surprising alliances.
Well, the problem that he would face if he did that, Freddie, is he'd run into the Israel lobby. The Israel lobby is deeply committed to making sure that the United States and Iran remain mortal enemies, at least as long as Iran has the capability to enrich uranium and reprocess plutonium. And therefore, I think if Trump began to play nice with Iran, the Israel lobby would move in and make it very clear to him that that's unacceptable, and he would change his behavior.
For viewers who have not read your work on the Israel lobby, what exactly is the Israel lobby?
Well, it's a group of individuals and organizations in the United States that are profoundly committed to making sure that the United States supports Israel unconditionally. It's very important to understand that the United States has a relationship with Israel that has no parallel in recorded history. The United States and Israel, despite the fact they sometimes have different interests, this is not to deny that they sometimes have the same interest, but they often have different interests. And in those cases, the lobby works overtime to make sure that the United States supports Israel unconditionally. And that's what the special relationship is all about. And the lobby is, I believe, the most powerful lobby or interest group in the history of the United States. And it wields enormous influence. And if any president pursues a policy in the Middle East that the Israelis adamantly oppose, you can rest assured that the lobby will go to work on Israel's behalf and push that American leader to support Israel. So on the Iran issue, Bill Clinton, when he was president, he started to play nice with the Israelis. And the lobby quickly moved in and told him the basic facts of life, which is he's not allowed to play nice with the Iranians because the Israeli government considers that unacceptable. I laid this out, Steve Walton and I laid this out in our chapter on Iran in the book on the Israel lobby.
Mm. Well, let's talk about whether there's a Ukraine lobby in Washington and what they might be thinking about Trump's latest moves. Scott Bessent is, I think, in Kiev at the moment, talking to Ukraine. There seems to be some kind of deal on the cards, which is that the US, in return for continuing to support Ukraine, will get more obvious access to Ukrainian minerals. And I wonder what you think about that, because to some extent that's a bit like what we were talking about early on, which is that Trump's much more transactional, much more nakedly selfish, if you like, or certainly national interest driven foreign policy is at least more direct and clear than the Biden administration's policy, which was to sort of sotto voce talk about Ukraine's minerals and how important they could be, but publicly to talk about democracy and the importance of defending it and so on.
Look, if you're a good realist, Freddie, you defend a country like Ukraine because you think it's in the American national interest. And basically, what Trump is saying is that if you don't pay us back for what he claims is the $300 billion that we've given you to fight this war, if you don't pay us back with this mineral wealth, we're going to cut off our assistance to you. This is what you call transactional. This is completely at odds with basic realist logic. I mean, it looks like we're in this to make money. And it's no accident that the German chancellor condemned Trump for making this claim or making this line of argument. It makes us look like we're mercenaries. Just a fundamental mistake, and it's completely at odds with realism. Trump told us that he was going to settle the Ukrainian conflict in one day. And there is no evidence that we are even close to settling the Ukraine conflict. And if anything, we're heading in the other direction. So he has failed so far. Now, of course, he's only been in office for 3 weeks, but there is no evidence that he has a plan for shutting this war down. And it looks like the war is going to go on. And it looks like he is doing everything he can to dump this war into the lap of the Europeans. And it looks like the Europeans are coming to recognize that they don't have any choice but to accept much more of the burden of dealing with this war. So this is bad news all around. Bad news for the Ukrainian people, bad news for the Russians, bad news for the United States, bad news for the West, because we're not going to shut this one down anytime soon.
If it isn't realism, what is it? Is it mercantilism? Is it, I've seen people calling it national capitalism. Is it something new entirely?
I don't know. It's just, Trump sowing chaos. It's hard to say. As I've said, a few times here, I'm not exactly sure what Trump is up to. It doesn't make sense to me to say, after all of the attention the United States has paid to the Ukraine war, after all the support that the United States has given to Ukraine, to all of a sudden turn around and say, if you don't give us a huge chunk of your mineral wealth, we're going to abandon you. But if you don't, right, if you do give us all of this mineral wealth, we won't abandon you. We'll continue to support the war. That's what he's saying. That's certainly not a realist perspective, certainly not a morally correct perspective. And it raises the question, what is he doing here? Why do this? And I don't have a good answer.
Well, I mean, it might be answered by looking at his relationship to Russia, or his approach to Russia, his approach to Putin and the Kremlin. He has appeared to be a realist when it comes to Russia's interests, or understanding Russia's interests in the past. Russia in recent days has released an American hostage. I think it's going to a prisoner, I should say. I think it's going to release another. Something's going on there, is it not? What can we interpret about that?
What's going on? I mean, I want to know what the plan is. The Russians have made it very clear what they want. And the question is, what is Trump willing to do to accommodate the Russians? What's the plan? There's no evidence they have a plan. There's no evidence there are any meaningful contacts between the Russians and the Americans for purposes of shutting this war down. So I don't think that releasing some prisoner makes any difference at all. The question is, what is the deal? What does Trump think he can do to shut this war down? And there's no evidence that the administration has the foggiest idea how they can shut this war down. And instead, Trump has been saying outrageous things about the Russians that are, if anything, designed to erode trust between the Russians and the Americans, and there's not very much trust to begin with. But, he says that the Russians have suffered 1 million deaths, which is a ludicrous claim, that their economy is in shambles, which is another ludicrous claim. And he says that he's going to do Putin a favor by shutting this war down for him, that we're going to do Putin a favor. Do you think this is going to make Putin think that Trump is somebody he can trust? Of course not. And Putin doesn't trust the West much at all. And Trump is just making the problem worse. So there's no concrete proposal floating around. There are no viable ideas coming out of the administration on how to accommodate the Russians, who happen to be in the driver's seat on the battlefield. And instead, what you're getting are rather outlandish statements that, if anything, going to make it harder to get a deal rather than easier.
Well, lastly, John, because I know I'm taking up a lot of your time here, but I would like to ask you a bit about China, which we talked a little bit about at the beginning. You did. Anyway, is that I'd like to put it to you that the real strategic focus of the Trump administration, as we understand it so far, and even more so in this second term, it seems, is dealing with China, dealing with the rise of China, confronting the rise of China. And he has people like Elbridge Colby in his administration who are very concerned about that. And that, when you look at the Panama Canal, what he's talking about in the Panama Canal, that's very much a concern about China's Belt and Road Initiative, which has now, the Panamanian leader has said he will get rid of the Belt and Road, I believe. If you look at Greenland, that's long been a strategic concern that China is, could break through in the Arctic Circle and so on. The real focus is China. And if we want to make any sense of Trump's foreign policy, we need to think about what it's thinking about China.
I think that there's no question that the United States should be riveted on China, and it should think about how best to smartly contain China. I think that being pinned down in the Middle East and being pinned down in Ukraine makes it difficult for the United States to focus its attention on dealing with China. And therefore, one hoped that Trump would come in and shut down the conflict in Gaza, shut down the conflict in Ukraine, and concentrate on fashioning a smart containment policy in East Asia. That has not happened. As I said, he is, if anything, making the situation in Gaza worse, and not doing much at all to get us out of the Middle East. And there's no evidence that he's going to put an end to the Ukraine war. So we're pinned down in these two places, which causes us all sorts of problems in East Asia. Furthermore, if you look at what's happened in East Asia since he's taken office, there are all sorts of articles beginning to appear that because of what he's done with USAID, our position in Southeast Asia, where we have long had problems fashioning alliances that can help us contain China, our situation there in Southeast Asia is getting worse. And given Trump's tendency to slap allies around, it's not clear to me that he's going to do a really good job fashioning a balancing coalition in East Asia against China. So I think the situation in East Asia is actually not looking good at all.
And actually, this time, lastly, I know I said lastly last time, but I would like to ask you by answering sort of yes/no question. You don't have to answer at length if you don't want to. A lot of people talk about the Trump administration as reversing America's decline as a superpower. It sounds to me from what you're saying that you believe he could be accelerating its decline. Do you believe he's accelerating it or reversing it or checking it in some way?
Well, when I think about decline, Freddie, I think of it in terms of the balance of power. And I think about how powerful the United States is in material terms versus how powerful China and Russia are relative to the United States. And the reason that the United States has been declining in terms of its power over time is because China has been rising. So it's in terms of relative power that we have been declining. But in terms of absolute power, if you look at the state of the American economy is doing quite well. It's growing. And I believe that if you look at the future, right, there's every reason to think that the US economy will do very well. But the question is, how well will the Chinese economy continue to do? And if the Chinese economy were to grow at a really significant rate in the years ahead, then there would be relative decline for the United States, because relative to China, we would be declining, even though our economy would be growing every year. So I think American decline mainly has to do with the Chinese economy. Now, to take this a step further, and I think this is a very important point, when we talk about containing China and we talk about dealing with China from an American point of view, the focus is usually on containment and putting together a balancing coalition, which involves usually a focus on military force. But there's another competition that's taking place, and that has to do with cutting edge technologies, things like AI, quantum computing, super chips, and so forth and so on. And there is a wickedly intense competition taking place there. And that competition for high-end technologies matters enormously for the balance of economic power, which, of course, for a good realist like me, is of great consequence. So I think moving forward, the key question is, how well does China do with AI, for example, versus how well the United States does with AI, right? And this will tell you a great deal about American decline moving forward. Now, all of this is to say, just to go to the heart of your point or your question, I don't think that Trump is doing anything yet that is eroding America's absolute power, right? Or speeding up America's relative decline. What Trump is having great trouble with so far, and again, he's only been 3 weeks into his administration, is the diplomacy that comes along with military power. The United States has this enormous power. It's still the most powerful state on the planet. The question is, what does American diplomacy look like? How is America using all that power that it has to fashion or to influence events around the world that are in the American national interest? And that's where I have all sorts of doubts about what Trump is doing. And of course, I had all sorts of doubts about what Biden was doing before Trump. So I think that in terms of power, the United States is not in bad shape. I think it's in terms of how it uses that power that it gets itself into trouble. And that's what worries me about Trump.
Has the West betrayed Ukraine? That's the question which our staff writer Svetlana Morinets discusses now with our Russia correspondent Owen Matthews.
What did you make of last night's announcement from Donald Trump?
Firstly, I would say that we didn't hear much new things from Trump, because even the Biden administration was saying the same things, that it's highly unlikely that Ukraine will become a NATO member in the close future, or that Ukraine can return all of its occupied territories in a military way. So all those things were already on the table, just Biden was not saying it as openly as Trump did yesterday. What was quite disappointing for Ukraine and Ukrainian government, that he said those points yesterday before actual talks with Russia. So he gave up the negotiation points before starting talks with Russia. So it means that now Ukraine is left with less leverage. because at the beginning, Putin said that he invaded because he wouldn't like Ukraine to be a NATO member. And now he is not going to be worried about that because Trump already stated that it is off the table. He is not going to be worried about American troops being on the ground in Ukraine because Trump already said it's not going to happen. So it opens for Putin the possibility to push forward even more concessions from Ukraine because all those other concerns that were worrying him are off the table right now.
And what did you make of it in context of what had gone on the week before? Because we knew that Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, has been in Kiev, and it looked as though there seemed to be sort of very Trump-like agreement with Ukraine in the offing that was going to be more about whether America gets sort of control of Ukrainian minerals in return for support. And then very Trump-like, I would say, that he then unravels that all in one Truth Social post.
Trump didn't say that he is going to stop the aid to Ukraine. It was crucial because he is waiting for that deal to happen and Zelensky is reviewing it at the moment. So he expects that America will continue supplying weapons to Ukraine in exchange for access to Ukraine minerals and other resources that we have in our country. I don't know if that Zelensky will sign the deal, considering that Trump didn't offer any security guarantees for Ukraine, and it is very unclear if that weapon supply will actually happen, because right now it's only on talks and not on the paper. And actually after Trump's speech yesterday, many Ukrainians were calling on Zelensky not to sign the deal until we receive still security guarantees from US that Russia won't invade again if the peace deal is signed.
Owen, what do you think is going on here? What's Trump's game? How do we square what was going on with Scott Bessent with what he's talking about last night? How should we read the situation?
I think the time has come to stop lying to Ukraine and stop lying to ourselves. And Svetlana is right that the US administration was a little bit more skeptical towards the end about its initial promises to support Ukraine until victory and give Ukraine whatever it takes. But the real dissonance was between Trump's very pragmatic and frankly brutal, and to many Ukrainians very insulting position of sort of frank truth-telling. The difference between what Trump is saying, what the Europeans are saying, and what the British are saying. I mean, the British Secretary of Defense is still absolutely singing from that old hymn book that we should, support Ukraine and that Ukraine will fight on. But where Trump is cutting through is he's saying the things that he's saying, the quiet part out loud, things that everyone has pretty much known to be true, and in sort of off-the-record conversations with many of Zelensky's closest advisors and colleagues in the presidential administration. I mean, I haven't met anybody, not even the most senior Zelensky advisors, who actually ever believed that they were really going to get Crimea back. And in fact, there was deep skepticism about getting Donbass back. And furthermore, I mean, it's always been clear right from the beginning, I mean, that there is no technical, political, or legal way for Ukraine to become a full member of NATO. It was always totally chimerical, and it was sort of absurd that we were even discussing it, that it is a real possibility, given the catastrophic consequences of that discussion in terms of Russia's reaction. So although Trump's cynicism is pretty offensive, in saying he wants to get back his return on investment and get Ukraine minerals. I mean, that's not exactly Churchillian or Rooseveltian. That's pretty sordid. Despite the fact that he's blunt, offensive, and transactional, my point in my latest piece is actually I think Trump has the best opportunity yet to actually bring this conflict to an end. And by discarding the pieties that would otherwise have been discussed, I mean, what Svetlana calls like negotiating points, but I mean, they're not negotiating points that really could ever be exchanged for anything, because there was no meaningful way in which there really could have been a path to full NATO membership, for instance, or for recovery of territories. That's not on the table, so it would have been a waste of time to discuss it anyway. So in that sense, we're just really down to brass tacks, like the very fundamentals of what's actually going to happen otherwise, as opposed to what we in the West might want to happen.
Well, I will let Svetlana respond to that. I mean, you mentioned a guarantee that Russia won't invade again. I don't think that's off the cards, is it?
Of course, because one of the main problems right now is that Trump's team said that those peacekeeping troops, European troops, for example, British troops that will monitor the front line after the peace deal is signed, they won't be safeguarded by the NATO Article 5. So it has to be some kind of different guarantee and procedure what they're going to do if Russia attacks again. And that's the main point, because for Ukraine, right now Ukraine is fighting for its independence and sovereignty as a country, even if part of our territory is still occupied. And the most important thing is to ensure that this war doesn't start again, because after all these statements that are coming from Trump administration, Ukrainians are already talking that we should prepare for another war, and it's horrible. And imagine that we end up in a deal when Ukraine doesn't get any security guarantees. And for example, we have not been offered any yet, except for European troops on the ground in Ukraine. But again, there is nobody saying what they're going to do if Russia invades again, if Russia attacks again. And imagine that we sign a deal without those security guarantees, and then Ukraine lifts the martial law in Ukraine, and then we open the border, and a lot of people are going to flee, especially people who have children whose sons are 17 years old and they're close to the conscription age. They will want to save their children from the possible war. We already had it happen in 2014, 2015, when a lot of people fled. And is Europe ready to accept many more millions of Ukrainian refugees again? If they think that the war is going to happen again, they're going to leave Ukraine.
From Zelensky's point of view, then, as you understand it, what is an acceptable security guarantee?
What he said recently, if Ukraine is not a NATO member, then the security guarantee will be to provide Ukraine long-range weapons, long-range missiles, and to finance Ukrainian army, because Ukraine will need to have a strong army as Russia has, and somebody has to pay money for that. The same goes for the peacekeeping troops in Ukraine. Somebody has to sponsor their stations there every day. Who is going to do it? Trump's team says that it's up to Europe to finance that and to secure the peace in Ukraine after the war ends. Is Europe ready for those expenses? We don't know yet.
Oh, and it sounds to me like your problem is just with the way Trump says things, not with what he's actually saying. Am I being cynical about you?
I'm in strong agreement with Svetlana that the absolute bottom line and the key point that the Ukraine and that the West have to come away with and focus on is a security guarantee that stops this happening again. That's totally true. And it's also true, as Svetlana pointed out, that Trump has not touched that yet. If you think that the main wellspring of Putin's motivation was not actually imperialist fantasy, but what he considers to be Russia's vital national interests, and he's willing to sacrifice everything from hundreds of thousands of troops to his entire economy just to make sure that Ukraine specifically does not join NATO. He doesn't mind other countries joining NATO. He's fine with Finland and Sweden joining NATO. It's not NATO expansion, it's Ukraine being in NATO that really bothers him. Then signing up Ukraine for NATO is the one thing that is guaranteed to keep this war going. And exactly the same logic applies to peacekeepers. That actually the one thing that will absolutely guarantee that that Putin will test the Western will is to have Western groups on the boots on the ground. So I personally am of the opinion that in fact Ukraine is in fact going to end up being the best guarantor of its own security, and that's essentially what Zelensky said today. That was his response: "Is the Zelensky we had to make our own NATO," and that's not really as crazy as it sounds, because the Ukrainian army is by far the most powerful and populous and technically sophisticated and operationally sophisticated and experienced army on the European continent. The British army has got 55,000 deployable troops. That's fewer people than Ukraine has lost in this entire war, dead, probably far less. I mean, Ukraine's military has done an extraordinary job, and this is what we tend to ignore or forget when we talk about Putin's victory. Putin didn't go to war with NATO. He's not at war with Britain or America. He's at war with Ukraine. And it was Ukraine's army that fought this powerful country, 4 times its population, 20 times its economy, with nuclear weapons. It was the Ukrainians that fought them to a standstill. Okay, they had Western weapons. The Soviet Union had American weapons in World War II. It doesn't detract from the fact that actually the people that were fighting and dying. So actually, Ukraine itself has turned out to be an incredibly tough nut, and that the Russian army was fought to a standstill by them, and actually making sure that Ukraine has a functional and effective military, or maintaining the functionality and effectiveness of its military, I think is ultimately going to be the best security guarantee. In practical terms. And then, of course, you have diplomatic guarantees. And those have kind of a bad reputation because everyone's going to say, oh, it's like a second rerun of the Budapest memorandum of 1994 that supposedly guaranteed Ukraine's security in exchange for giving up nuclear weapons, and was basically not honored in 2014. That's exactly what it's going to be. It's going to be like a retread of the Budapest memorandum, but this time actually with, we hope, more binding force.
But Svetlana, is that a key point here? That what are Putin's actual intentions? Do you think, from the West point of view, not from Ukraine's, do you think that his intention is to keep invading parts of Eastern Europe until he can't be stopped, or until he isn't stopped anymore, until he takes over the world? Do we have to be realistic about what we think Putin's intentions are?
His first intention is to take over Ukraine completely, and in a lot of essays that he have written and what his aides are saying is that he wants to restore the Russian Empire. How seriously we should take that? Putin started the war in Georgia, also in Ukraine. Belarus is already under his complete control. He installed pro-Russian government in Georgia and is trying to do so in Moldova and Romania. So I think that Putin tries to reshape the sphere of influence of the America, of the Russia and China, and he thinks that Russia is one of the main players and they have to be ruling over this region. And I also think that one of his terms will be that NATO withdraws its troops from Eastern Europe, and it's quite very dangerous if to think about that. And also the Baltic states and Poland are so eager in supporting Ukraine because they are completely sure that they will be the next invaded. And right now we have a problem that they are not sure that NATO's Article 5 will actually work, considering that Trump is saying America first, and will actually they come to help if they are attacked. And one of the main Putin's goals was to break NATO apart and to bring the doubt to NATO allies that will they be protected in case of the war. And as for Ukraine, I would want to repeat Zelensky's point when he said first in 2022, when Russia invaded, Zelensky was ready for Ukraine to be neutral and said we are not going to be NATO members. But the invasion continued anyway. And recently he said, okay, we are not NATO members. If it was the goal of Russia that we will never join NATO, then Putin should withdraw from all the occupied Ukrainian lands. But instead, Russia's term right now is to keep the 4 regions it occupies. And also part of the lands that Ukraine still controls, and Ukraine obviously can never agree to that. And in those regions Russia holds, you can see that they erase Ukrainian language, Ukrainian culture, they can torture people if they see Ukrainian flag on the street. So one of the reasons also was a demographic situation in Russia, and right before the invasion, Putin said we have to manage that problem very fast before 2030. We don't have enough people in our country, and the fastest way to do it, as we see, was to invade Ukraine. And at the beginning, Putin's goal was to take over Kyiv and install the pro-Russian government there. For example, Viktor Medvedchuk, who was later exchanged to Russia. And that's why Russia right now is talking that Zelensky is not a legitimate president. And it was quite worrying to hear that yesterday from Trump. He didn't say that specifically, but he said also about the need for elections in Ukraine. And afraid that they will keep pushing this forward before the actual peace deal. And Putin recently said that Zelensky can't sign any peace document because he is not a legitimate president, because his term ran out last May. And nobody is talking that Putin is in power for 30 years already, but the problem is Zelensky, because we couldn't have the elections because of the war. And if we have the elections right now, first, it's very difficult to make them because how soldiers are going to vote, will they have to leave the front line, people who are abroad? And also it would just tear the country apart, and I would say it exactly what Putin wants.
Well, I mean, aside from the logistical difficulties of having an election during a war, I mean, why would it tear the country apart? Because a lot of people are unhappy with Zelensky? I mean, why? I didn't quite.
What is the benefit of having political rivalries in the times of the war? I mean, the only reason why Ukraine could stand against Russia was because at the beginning all the parties united, all the opposition united, and they said, okay, we are not going to talk about politics, we will do everything for Ukraine to survive. And actually last year all the opposition agreed that the elections are going to be held 6 months after the peace deal is signed. So it is agreed by everyone in the parliament, and the most of the Ukrainian population is against elections before the peace deal is made. So why to pressure Ukraine trying to do that? And also taking into account that Russian missiles can target any of the polling stations. How can you ensure that people will be safe, and that also international observers will come to Ukraine while the country is still at war, and they will try to monitor that elections are fair? How people in occupied lands are going to vote? Are they going to vote at all? If they don't vote, does it mean that they belong to Russia right now because they don't have the right to choose the Ukrainian president? So there are a lot of these things that Ukraine has to manage, and also we need to check how actually many people we have in Ukraine, because we have internally displaced people, and there are over 6 million inside of the country. How are they going to vote? So it's a long process, it's an expensive process, and also about the soldiers, they will have to leave the front line to vote. That's why only after the peace deal is made, the election is possible in Ukraine.
Oh, what do you think about Zelensky's position? In particular, because he and Trump have this interesting relationship going back to Trump's first term. His first impeachment, of course, was over Ukraine. Trump seems to regard him with more suspicion than most Western leaders. I think that's fair to say. And it looks like Trump is accepting this argument that if Ukraine is going to be a democracy, and we're talking about protecting democracies, then Ukraine needs to have elections. But Svetlana's made the case against that.
I don't think anyone in Ukraine disagrees that there should be elections. The only question is when they should be. Then they will tear Ukraine apart for two very good reasons. One, there is next to no chance that Zelensky will be re-elected. Currently, only 16% of the electorate would vote for him. The other reason that it will tear the country apart is that a large number of Zelensky's closest advisors will be in prison, or for the gigantic amount of money that they and their cronies have stolen, and that's also phenomenally corrosive of Ukrainian morale, because over 75% of Ukrainians believe that there's been a lot of profiteering over this war by government-adjacent oligarchs and cronies, and I fear that they're right. And the third reason is that the main issue of the Ukrainian elections is going to be a massive blame game. And there's going to be an absolutely sort of massive, what the Germans call it, Dolchstoßlegende, the stab in the back legend, that followed the German defeat in the First World War. And that goes that the German army was winning in the field and was stabbed in the back by cowardly civilians. And the current Ukrainian version of that is that we were completely betrayed, traduced by the West. They persuaded us to fight on. They didn't give us the arms. It's going to be an absolutely massive blame game, and the West is going to be absolutely vilified on all sides. In that sense, Zelensky's position, Trump's position, is very useful to Zelensky, to be honest, because making any kind of concessions is completely politically toxic. It's political death for any Ukrainian leader, not just Zelensky, but anybody, to make any kind of concessions, and especially to see the de facto partition of their country. the only way that actually in practical terms can be done is not with Ukrainian consent, because it's unachievable. It's only when someone comes in from outside and imposes that deal and leaves Zelensky no choice. He just has to say, like, I'm sorry, guys, we can't do this anymore because the Americans up there told us that no more arms, we can't do it, we have to, because we were forced into this humiliation. And politically, that is something that Zelensky can do. He can say, I did my best, and we were betrayed, stabbed in the back. But actually, in practical terms, Trump is delivering something that is pretty much inevitable, and it's been devastatingly obvious for some time the way this war will end, which is with de facto, not de jure, I mean not legally, but de facto partition of Ukraine along the line of control. And we don't know where that will be by the time the peace settlement comes, but the Russian steamroller grinds on. And the other element is going to be security guarantees for Ukraine short of NATO membership. That's what's going to happen. But it's not something that actually can be achieved inside Ukraine, because it's something that will be seen as a terrible defeat and humiliation. And therefore, America is a necessary part of the equation. It's absolutely essential for America to do that, and basically to close that deal, because it's not something that the Ukrainians can sort of politically or patriotically do for themselves.
Owen says that a majority of Ukrainians are against Zelensky now probably because they think he's corrupt, and they know about a lot of corruptions, or they think they know about a lot of corruption under his government. Do you think Zelensky is corrupt?
What Ukrainians are blaming Zelensky for is that he didn't prepare enough for the invasion. And recently we had, just last week, a Ukrainian former commander who was interviewed by one of Ukrainian media, and he said that until the last moment, Zelensky team was not saying to Ukrainian command that Russia was actually going to invade, and that they could mobilize all the troops only after Zelensky's order, and Zelensky delayed that order for too late. And also there is some blame, for example, that some of the bridges in the Kherson region were not blown up, so Russian troops could actually invade the region from Crimea, and they also blame Zelensky for this. But at the same time, I would say that it plays Zelensky in hand that there was no political rivalry in these 3 years. And I would say that many people are convinced that he actually can be re-elected for the second term if Valery Zaluzhny, the current Ukrainian ambassador to Britain, if he doesn't participate in the election, that Zelensky will be the one to win. Because according to all the polls, even if Zelensky has 16-20% of support, all the other possible possible candidates into presidents, they have much less. And it is one of the arguments why Ukrainians say maybe there is not a point making elections now, because Zelensky is going to be just re-elected, and what was all the point about having them right now?
I'm a bit suspicious of this argument that Zelensky isn't corrupt, it's just the people around him. I think that's not a very good defense of a leader. I mean, surely you need to be in control of your administration. But aside from that point, is there a political advantage is it in Zelensky's interest now to not win an election? If there's a negotiated peace, does he want to be the leader? Who wants to be the leader of Ukraine after this war? Because it's going to be very, very difficult.
We don't know yet if Zelensky is going to apply for the second term, because he is very ambiguous, and he says, we will see how the peace deal goes. I would say for him the right step would be to step down and just be remembered in Ukraine as a world leader who helped to preserve the country in the most crucial time, and to give a fresh breath to the Ukrainian politics. And so the new team comes and they help to solve Ukrainian problems, about to rebuild the country, about rebuilding our army, making all the reforms. But from what I hear, he's going to try for the second term. So I don't know. I think he has very high chances to win, especially if there will be only 6 months for the elections and all the other new candidates to emerge. They won't have time to gain that popularity that Zelensky still has. Of course, it has fallen significantly, but he's still very popular in Ukraine.
I wonder also, I'll ask you both about this. Owen raised this point about this feeling among Ukrainians of Western betrayal.
Yeah, of course.
This is we already hear a bit of this now It seems to me fair from a media point of view, because a lot of Western politicians said very firm things that will stay with Ukraine all the way. There were promises of NATO commitments from some people. But the West was never going to contribute troops to the Ukrainian effort. I think that was understood. And so what do Ukrainians fairly expect from the West?
Look, at the beginning, Ukraine really had a chance to throw out Russian troops, not from all of Ukraine, but most of the regions, when in 2022, Ukraine had a successful counteroffensive in Kharkiv region, and they kicked off Russians. And they kicked off Russians from Kherson. It is already reported that Biden administration said them to stop because they were fearing the nuclear war with Russia. And Ukrainians feel very angry about that, because we actually had a chance to continue the successful counteroffensive, but we were stopped, and Russia was allowed to regroup and then to continue their offensive in the next year. And also about the weapons, in 2023, when Ukraine went into another counteroffensive that everybody was expecting to be successful, but we had like 12 tanks. I mean, it was just wasting Ukrainian lives for nothing. And if you are at the beginning, our allies said that they will be with Ukraine until victory. At the beginning, they were saying that. Then they said, we're going to be with Ukraine as long as it takes. It was outrageous. What does it mean, as long as it takes? As long as the last Ukrainian dies, or how should we take that? And that was the...
Now you're sounding like a Russian, because you're saying the West was always going to fight till the last Ukrainian.
No, it's not what I mean.
Yeah.
It's what I mean is that they were not given us enough means to continue the fight, to actually have some gains and to win. They're just giving us enough not to lose the war completely. So the war was just going to drag on indefinitely. And what Ukrainians hoped is that when Trump comes, there will be more decisive things from him, not just like as long as it takes, but he actually stands with Ukraine, or we're talking about peace agreement, not just the war prolongs for years or decades. And unfortunately, there is a big disappointment about Trump right now, considering his statements, because Ukraine hoped actually he would stand on Ukraine's side. But now we see that his priority is to stop the killings as soon as possible. And I have nothing against stopping the killings. Ukrainians are the first who want this war to end. The problem is on what terms it will be.
Donald Trump, of course, says that the war never would have happened under his watch. But what Svetlana's talking about there is a fair point, which is that Ukrainians were probably right to feel betrayed by the West, because we do seem to have promised them victory. We promised them that we'd be on their side until the bitter end, and we were never really going to do that.
It's certainly true that we didn't give them as much as they wanted and needed. That's certainly true, but it does kind of beg the question, how much hypothetically in a conventional war situation would Ukraine have required in terms of men and material compared to the massive orders of magnitude size disparity between them and the Russian army. So I think the problem with it, with that argument, we were betrayed, is that it sort of strays dangerously close to kind of like sort of conceding the main Putin attack line, which is that the Ukrainians are just puppets and have no agency, and we were put up to it. They made us fight, and they didn't give us enough material, and we lost, and it's their fault. It's actually sort of strangely, in my opinion, kind of a denial of Ukraine's agency. Ukraine was attacked. Ukraine was fighting for its life. It was pleaded very effectively for as much material support as it could get. And then, as I've mentioned earlier in my earlier response, it did a fantastic and entirely unexpected by anybody, unexpectedly brilliant job of actually resisting the Russians right at the beginning. Through some very quick sort of tactical actions around Kiev in the first days of the war, and then later, the problem is that we're going to be hearing a lot more of these stories like, oh, we could have advanced, then, like we took Kherson but then we would prevent it from crossing the river. Like Svetlana just said that. Well, I mean, yeah, okay. I mean, there are a million sort of conspiracy theories of that nature that like America stopped us from winning. And those are the kind of things that defeated peoples tell themselves in order to feel less bad about their defeat. But actually, the Ukrainians, although they've lost territory, have actually fought the Russians to a standstill. That's not a defeat. Russia has beggared his own country. Putin has beggared his own country. He's turned it into a vassal of China. His only allies in the world are ridiculous rogue pariah states. He's completely blown his Gazprom's chokehold over Europe's strategic energy reserves. He's killed at least 200,000 of his own men. He's spending 40% of his. He's lost 1 million of his brightest and best people who have fled his regime. His war effort has been completely disastrous. The only thing that he's actually gained is not control over Ukraine. It's not control over any kind of post-Soviet space. In fact, what he's done is he's got 22% of an absolutely devastated, war-torn country, Ukraine, and increased the surface area of the Russian Federation by 0.4%. I mean, it's like tiny. So, I mean, it's a catastrophe and for Putin. And I think that a lot of the discourse over the next days and weeks and months, by the way, this isn't going to happen very quickly. I think Putin's going to sort of play hard to get and draw out the negotiations. But I think that it's really important not to lose sight of the fact that this is not a defeat for Ukraine. And it's rather surprising to hear that the Ukrainians themselves discussing it in those terms, because they're actually doing themselves a disservice. They've actually done a magnificent thing, just as the Finns did in 1939 to 40. And they've actually saved their country and pushed back against it. It's a real David and Goliath story.
Svetlana, would you like to come back on that? We've got a response to what Owen's saying there.
I would add about Ukrainian occupied territories, because what I hear all the analytics talking about it just as a piece of land, then let just Russia keep it, and why Ukraine was so eager to actually deoccupy them, because we have thousands of Ukrainians still living there under Russian regime with no freedom, with no rights, forced to learn Russian language and with history rewritten, with them being imprisoned, with journalists that are being imprisoned in Crimea, for example, constantly, for example, like Crimean Tatars, there are constant repressions in those lands, and nobody in the West seems to care about the fate of those people, what actually happens to them, and nobody also talks right now about what reparations Ukraine is going to receive for all the suffering it has suffered. Zelensky offered Trump that he seizes 300,000 billion of Russian frozen assets, and what I saw today from reporting that Trump refused it. So who is going to pay for reparation? Is it going to be Europe? How is it going to work? Because for now, the deal, what it seems to emerge, is that Putin keeps those occupied territories. Of course, they are not going to be internationally recognized as Russian, but he is going to keep his control over them. But he will be rewarded of his aggression, but he is not going to pay for all those crimes that he and his army committed in Ukraine. And how is it a just peace?
Our economics editor, Kate Andrews, was joined by the Shadow Home Secretary, Chris Philp, to discuss the Tories' plans for migration and citizenship.
I want to start by asking you what now the Conservative Party's philosophy is on immigration. Before we get into Labour's bill, before we get into your new plans for visas, how would you sum up the Tories' philosophy on this very crucial public policy point?
Well, let me start with legal migration. We've seen in the past numbers that have been far, far too high, including people coming here with low levels of skill, earning low wages. Now, the view we take that is no longer acceptable. It's completely wrong. And we would like to pivot away from mass low-skilled migration towards much, much lower numbers of people with very high levels of skill who can earn high salaries and actually add value to our economy in fields like finance, IT, scientific research, and so on. Recent analysis has shown that low-wage migration is actually a cost to the taxpayer, because people coming here on low wages end up consuming more in public services, if you include their dependents particularly, than they pay in tax. It's actually bad for the economy. It's bad for taxpayers. And of course, at the same time, we've got 9 million people here in the UK who are of working age, but not working. Now, some of those people, of course, have caring responsibilities, or they might be studying, but millions of people could be working, and we'd rather get them into work instead of importing low-skill migrant labour. So that low-skill migrant labour has to stop. That means businesses need to take a different approach. They need to invest more, for example, in technology and in mechanisation. In South Korea, there is 9 times the density of robotic automation in factories compared to the UK. They're much more automated. They need fewer people. Other sectors, including even agriculture, can automate more as well. So we need to see businesses doing that instead of importing large numbers of cheap labourers. On the illegal side, we need to just have zero tolerance for that. We need tough measures to stop things like the boats. That's why the Rwanda scheme was so important. And then domestically, people here who are here already illegally or who have overstayed their visa just need to be removed. And we're going to be looking at changes that may be necessary to the legal framework, including human rights, to make sure that we can remove people who are here illegally or who have committed a criminal offence. So broadly, that's our philosophy. Zero tolerance to illegal immigration and ending the era of mass low-skilled migration.
Let's look at Labour's border security, asylum and immigration bill. Based off the philosophy that you just laid out, there seem to me to be 2 key takeaways. The first is that there's going to be far harsher penalties for those who would engage in people smuggling. And they also plan to lift the ban that the Tories had on people claiming asylum who came to the UK through unauthorised means. On this first point, do the Tories really disagree with that harsher punishment?
Well, it's not harsher. It is already a criminal offence to facilitate illegal migration.
But they're going to increase the punishment.
They're not. It's the maximum sentence for facilitating illegal migration under Section 25 of the 1971 Immigration Act is life. We actually in government increased that penalty, the maximum penalty, from 14 years to life. Labour voted against that in the last Parliament. They're introducing some new offences like endangering life at sea, but those only have a maximum penalty of 5 years, and they simply duplicate the existing offence, right? The much broader offence of facilitating illegal migration that has a higher penalty.
They're expanding it to even supplying parts for boats. They're expanding it to people who might be trying to help somebody from the UK. Does the Tory party really take issue with that?
Look, we don't take issue with going after people smugglers, obviously, but I would say that the existing criminal offence of facilitating illegal migration, which is a broad term, covers all of those things you just described, has a maximum penalty of life. That's on the statute books already. But look, of course we support any measures to give the law enforcement community more powers. Now, but I think it's frankly duplicates what's already on the statute book. On your second point, you're quite right. This border security bill, or border surrender bill as I prefer to call it, gives illegal immigrants a path to citizenship, which doesn't exist today. And it also cancels the government's obligation to remove people who have come here illegally. I think those are 2 massively retrograde steps. It also completely repeals the Safety of Rwanda Act, which is the bill we had to finally pass last year to get around all these court cases that would have enabled people to be sent to Rwanda if they came here illegally. Now, that Rwanda scheme was never started because Labour cancelled it just after the election. The first flight had been due to take off on July the 24th, and I believe very strongly that if that Rwanda scheme had gone ahead as planned, the deterrent effect would have stopped the crossings. And I say that because we saw it work in Australia 10 or so years ago with Australia's Operation Sovereign Borders. We saw a removals deterrent also work with the Albanian cohort. So in 2022, a lot of Albanians were crossing the channel. It was the single biggest nationality. We struck a deal with Albania to quickly return them, and very rapidly the number of Albanians dropped by 93%. Kind of stands to reason that if you're in France and you know if you cross to the UK you're going to get sent somewhere, whether it's to Albania or Rwanda pretty quickly, you're not going to bother attempting the crossing. So Labour made a massive mistake by cancelling that before it started, and they've now repealed the legislation that would have enabled it to happen. So even if they change their mind in 6 or 12 months' time, they're now not going to have the legislative basis to run a scheme like Rwanda. So catastrophic mistake in my view.
What legal pathways would people arriving undocumented use?
Well, first of all, people who are already in a safe country, like France, should claim asylum there rather than attempting to illegally cross the channel. And in fact, the UN Refugee Convention from 1951 recognises that in Article 31.
What legal pathways through the UK would these people use?
Well, people who want to come here legally. So we've created legal pathways. Let me give you a few examples. There's the Ukrainian scheme that's seen 300,000 people come here.
Yes, but you have to be Ukrainian.
We've also had a scheme for Syrians when there was a civil war there. That was about 25,000 people between 2015 and 2020. There was a scheme for people in Hong Kong being persecuted, the British National Overseas Scheme, and we had schemes operating for Afghans, the Arab and Iraq Scheme. In addition to that, you've got things like refugee family reunion. So there are plenty of safe and legal routes, like I've just outlined. We're more than doing our bit as a country in terms of taking in genuine refugees. I've just mentioned 5 examples of routes there. What we can't allow is people illegally crossing the channel from France. France is a safe country. Almost all the people coming across are young single men who have paid people smugglers, and we can't have those people illegally entering the country and jumping to the front of the queue when there are far more deserving cases like the ones I've just mentioned.
The reason I asked the question is because the schemes that you just mentioned, which are widely publicized, are also nationality specific for the most part. One of the arguments that was made when the Tory government was trying to push through the Rwanda scheme is let Rwanda happen first, more legal pathways will come second. But those new legal pathways weren't announced, and a lot of people listening will be asking themselves, okay, if you're going to make it an offense to arrive on the shores of the UK without documentation, what pathway would people who are not of the nationalities you just mentioned otherwise pursue? They were not announced after Rwanda by the Tory government.
Well, of course, the refugee family reunion path is not nationality specific. That applies to any nationality. But the intention was, once the illegal arrivals have been dealt with, then there would be capacity to set up a limited legal route, but that would be decided by the government and by Parliament. It wouldn't be for people smugglers. But of course, because the Rwanda scheme never started, the illegal crossings are continuing under this Labour government. And in fact, they've got worse. Since the election, the illegal crossings of the English Channel have gone up by 28% compared to the same period last year. 25,000 people have arrived illegally since the general election. So there is simply no capacity to do anything more than that. Now, if a future government, I hope a future Conservative government, uses a removal deterrent like the Rwanda scheme to stop the illegal crossings completely, then there might be capacity to look at a limited, safe and legal scheme. But before we can think about that, we've got to stop the illegal migration first, because right now there is no capacity. The government has, I think, tens of thousands of people in hotels. It's costing £3-5 billion a year to accommodate those people. So right now there isn't the capacity because of the illegal migration. So let's deal with that first. Then we can think about whether we have any more capacity beyond that.
You note the 28% increase to illegal entry.
28%.
28% increase of illegal entry to the UK. But statistics are a funny game. So based on that percentage, we're calculating roughly 25,000 small boats crossings from the 5th of July 2024 to February 2025, which is up by about 5,500 from the previous year. But since January 1st, you've had 1,554 illegal entries versus 1,506 in 2024 under the Tories. That's a negligible difference. And fundamentally, the issue continues to be the same under both governments. We can play the percentages game, but the numbers really aren't that far apart.
Well, since the election, they've gone up by 28%.
But as I just said, you've picked the dates to calculate that.
Hang on a
If we start from January 1st...
Wait a minute, you've picked 4 weeks, okay? Actually, January to January, I think the difference was up 12%. But look, you've picked 4 weeks. Let's take the entire...
It's up about 54 people.
Let's take the entire period of time since the election, not just 4 weeks, but the entire 7 months. Across the entire 7 months, the illegal crossings are up by 28%. But the truth is, frankly, any number is too high because it's illegal. And I think the only way you're going to stop this completely, which is important for border security, it's important for the safety of life. Like 78 people have died in the last year or so. The only way you're going to stop this completely is by having a deterrent, right? Where you know if you're going to turn up here, you're going to get sent either back to your country of origin, if it's safe, or to some safe third country like Rwanda. And Labour cancelled that deterrent before it even started. We've seen it work elsewhere, like I've said. And they made a massive mistake by cancelling that deterrent. So we are certainly going to look to reintroduce something similar if we win the next election. That will stop these crossings completely. There'll be zero if we do that. And we saw that work in Australia. It went literally from 50,000 to zero under Operation Sovereign Borders around about 10 years ago.
I bring up the percentages game because something similar happened with the Albanian migrants. You mentioned that they fell by 92% after Rishi Sunak struck the deal. But then if you looked at the quarters that continued, because numbers rose by a negligible amount, you could actually argue that they rose by a huge percentage as well. And I think there are a lot of people who are frustrated about the net figure, the net total immigration statistics, who, if we're going to get into the politics of this, feel like they're not always being told the full story when we talk about those statistics. They feel as though it's blurring the numbers, because if you actually look at the numbers, there's not a substantial difference.
You're talking about illegal migration?
Yes.
Yeah, well, like I've said already, since the general election, the last 7 months, there are about 28%, I've said it like 4 or 5 times now, there are 28% more people that have entered illegally than the same period 12 months prior. That is a significant increase. But frankly, the numbers before were too high. It should be 0. Nobody should be entering the country illegally by small boat. And I remain completely convinced that a removals deterrent, like Rwanda, but it could be another country, it doesn't have to be Rwanda, a removals deterrent in principle would stop this. And people like the National Crime Agency have said you need a deterrent to stop the crossings. Law enforcement alone, it's important, law enforcement, but on its own, it's not enough. And that's why it was such a stupid mistake of the government, the Labour government, to cancel the Rwanda deterrent. They should have given it a try, but they didn't. They just, for ideological reasons, cancelled it before it even started. And we're now seeing European countries. I mean, Italy are doing it already, but we're now seeing suggestions that, a new government in Germany, after their election in a few weeks' time, might well be looking at something similar. So I think we're going to see other European countries going ahead with that kind of approach, and certainly the USA are beginning to look at it as well, whereas the Labour government are going apparently in the opposite direction, and that's why illegal migration on their watch so far has gone up.
The new Tory leadership laments that the Rwanda scheme was rolled back. If you were back in charge in 4.5 years, would re-implementing the Rwanda scheme be a day one policy?
Yes, it would. And if we couldn't get agreement with Rwanda specifically, we'd try and do something similar with another country.
Well, let's move on to the Tories' proposition for visa changes. Now we're going to move on to legal migration. The plans that you've announced are that newcomers should wait 10 years instead of 5 before they can apply for indefinite leave to remain. And after that, it should take another 5 years, not 12 months as it currently is, to apply for British citizenship. Will these plans be retroactive? Will people who are currently on work visas looking to apply for leave to remain, would they be subject to these changes if the Tories came in 4.5 years?
Yes, that is kind of the whole point, because there are around about 2 million people who are now here on work visas who may in theory become eligible for ILR. The Centre for Policy Studies estimated last Sunday that probably about 800,000 of those would likely end up with ILR using current assumptions. Now, many of those people are on low incomes, and recent analysis shows that immigrants who come here and work on low wages actually don't make a fiscal contribution, like a net contribution to the economy. In fact, the Office for Budget Responsibility, not everybody's favourite organisation, but they did some analysis, I think it was last September, showing that a migrant on low wages has a net fiscal cost to the rest of the taxpayers of £500,000 across their lifetime. So people who come here and either earn low wages and therefore don't make a contribution, we don't think they should get indefinite leave to remain. It's not fair that the wider taxpayer ends up having to subsidise people who have only recently arrived. If it looks like they're going to be dependent on the state, we don't think they should get indefinite leave to remain either. Certainly if someone commits a criminal offence, they shouldn't. And when that visa expires, it shouldn't be renewed. Those people should be required to leave. And if in the course of their stay here, it looks like they're going to become dependent on the state for some reason, but they're supposed to be here for work, they've got a work visa, then again, the visa should be revoked and they should be required to leave. It's not fair on the British taxpayer that somebody can come here, become potentially dependent, and then ask the rest of the taxpayers to subsidise, and that's not fair. And that's the principle behind the proposal. Now, if people come here and work and make a contribution, that is a different story. They would be eligible for indefinite leave. But we also want to make sure the numbers arriving go down a lot, because the numbers were far too high. Mistakes were made by previous governments, including previous Conservative governments. Those numbers were too high. So we want to see much smaller numbers of high-skill, genuinely high-skill migrants. One of the ways we can do that is having a hard binding cap on the number of visas that are issued each year. The number could be set by Parliament in a vote at a level that is much, much lower than the recent numbers we've seen, and much, much lower than recent forecasts that people like the ONS and the OBR have produced.
I was surprised not to see any reference to the shortage occupation list in the Tories' press release, if you are looking at removing people who would otherwise come here on lower wages, surely that is what you would focus on.
Well, look, for those lower skilled, lower wage jobs, some of which do appear on the shortage occupation list, as you say, we think the solution to that should not be reaching for large scale, low wage migration, which is what's happened for the last 20 or 30 years. We think that is a mistake. It's fiscally negative. It costs other taxpayers money, as I've said already. It's crazy that we're doing that when we have 9.3 or 9.4 million existing UK residents of working age but who aren't working. Now, for many of those, there are good reasons why they're not working, but for many of them, there are not good reasons, and the priority should be getting those people into work, not importing vast numbers of people from other countries on very low wages.
I just noticed that it wasn't actually mentioned in the announcement, but let's come back to that because I want to get into a few of these details first. Your changes suggest that these updates would not apply to those on the Ukraine scheme, nor would they apply to the British national overseas from Hong Kong visas. I assume the reason that the Afghan citizens resettlement scheme was left off is because there are no changes to that either.
Yeah, there wouldn't be any proposal to change the Afghan scheme, no.
So there are no changes to that
because that's essentially a humanitarian scheme.
Right. And the Tory party explains its decision to make these visa changes as follows, that the right to remain in the UK has been seen as automatic entitlement. It has become a conveyor belt to citizenship, when UK citizenship should be a privilege that is earned through commitment and contribution. I think that language will be very surprising to a lot of legal migrants who have gone through painstaking lengths to stay in the UK.
Well, at the moment, once someone has come in on a work visa and been here for 5 years, as you've said already, then getting indefinite leave to remain is essentially, it's near automatic. Now, we don't think that's right. We think people should only, because indefinite leave to remain, as the name implies, means you can stay here pretty basically forever, unless you commit a serious criminal offence or have committed fraud in obtaining ILR. It basically means you can stay here forever. It also entails entitlement to the full range of benefits, full access to social housing, full rights to things like pensions. Now, we think that should not be something that is essentially automatic once someone has been here for 5 years, and it's reasonable to say there should be a test. We should actually say, okay, somebody came in on a work visa, okay, fine. Have they actually worked during those 5 years as they said they would? Have they worked at a level of salary that means they're actually making a net contribution to the economy? Have they refrained from committing any criminal acts? Those are all reasonable questions to ask. And instead of everybody just automatically getting ILR, which in the next 4 or 5 years is going to amount to hundreds of thousands, possibly over 1 million people. Instead of that being automatic, there should be a test. Is the person contributing? Have they, behaved as a good citizen by not committing crime? That is a reasonable question to ask before they get given a ticket, which lets them stay here forever and access the full range of benefits of, that are very close to being the benefits of citizenship.
So, hands up. I am an immigrant from America who's gone through the visa process. Let me tell you why some of this language is just surprising to me. So you focus on the 5 years that one can come over on a top-tier work visa and then be eligible for leave to remain. But for many migrants, that is not the process in which they're going to take. If you are a student, then on a graduate visa, then on a work visa, you're already looking at a 10-year process. If we looked at those who were granted leave in 2023, about a third of them are in the specific scheme that you just discussed. But for many people, this is a longer process. It includes immigration fees, it includes an NHS surcharge, it includes taking a leave to remain test, which a Life in the UK test, I believe it's called, which the University of Essex found that the vast majority of Brits wouldn't pass. We don't need to get into those questions now. But to talk about it as an automatic right, again, surprising language, and one that is very targeted at business that would be bringing over those high-skilled migrants, the type that you said at the start of this conversation you wanted to keep in the UK.
Well, there's a distinction between bringing people over to work in high-skilled jobs and then ultimately getting ILR. You can come here to work on a high-skilled job, with a work visa. The question of whether you can then reside here in perpetuity is a separate question. Now, for those initial work visas, when people come in for the first time, we would like to see much, much lower numbers. That's why we need this binding cap that I talked about earlier. But for people who are coming here to work in genuinely high-skilled jobs, in finance, in technology, in scientific research, in those kind of, even journalism, in those kind of fields, then we should actually make that pretty straightforward. If they're going to really make a big contribution to our society, that is different to the question of ILR. ILR means you can stay here forever, and I think it is reasonable to say that there should be some kind of like proper test, like have you worked, have you earned to the salary level you said you would. Those are reasonable questions to ask. At the moment, those questions are not asked. Somebody that's been here 5 years on a work visa just gets that status automatically, and we think there should just be a check, and I think that's a completely reasonable thing to do.
So I do have to challenge that. When you put in a leave to remain application, you have to prove your salary, you have to prove that you've been here legally the entire time, you have to prove full-time employment, you have to state any criminal record, including a driver's fine or a ticket that you got when you were a teenager. All of those questions are asked. They go through the Home Office. Now, perhaps you're saying it's not scrutinized enough. Perhaps you're saying there are too many loopholes, but these questions are asked.
Yeah, but people, they're not as you've already kind of answered the question yourself. They're not assessed currently by the Home Office in a way that says, well, if you haven't met a certain, there's no salary threshold for getting ILR, and we think there basically should be, because we know now from the analysis.
But there's a salary threshold to be on a top tier work visa.
There's a salary. That's right. There's a salary threshold to get a visa in the first place, but people may come here and then not work at that salary. And actually, what's happened in the last few years, and this is a mistake by the last government, which Kemi and I have honestly identified and pointed to. Even though in theory, the points-based system was supposed to be the brightest and the best, and top tier, high skill, etc. 68% of people, of non-EU migrants coming in on work visas over the last few years were earning below median earnings, and around about half were actually working on the minimum wage. So what was supposed to be a points-based system for the brightest and the best ended up getting essentially misapplied because it wasn't calibrated properly. And a lot of people came in intentionally to work in very low wage jobs. And the sort of most obvious example of that is the health and social care visa, which was supposed to have 6,000 people come in, and it turned out to be like 300,000 people.
But that's why I asked about the shortage occupation list and why it wasn't mentioned in the Tories' immigration reform. Has the party done any modeling about what will happen if you do really reduce the number of people coming here, especially on those lower wages? What will happen overnight to the NHS, to the care services?
So what we're going to be doing in terms of the question you're asking really speaks to the level of the cap that we're proposing, the binding cap on how many visas get given out each year for people coming in. Now, we've said it'll be a lot lower than recent numbers and a lot lower than the ONS and OBR forecasts, which have been around about 300 or 350,000 a year net. Be a lot lower than that. We haven't yet specified a number, and the reason we haven't specified the number, you've effectively just alluded to. We want to do that detailed work.
You're going to do modelling.
Exactly, to look at the flows in, the flows out. We'll do that obviously by sector. Student visas. We'll look at the health service. We'll look at different business sectors, agriculture, finance, and so on, to make sure we have a kind of proper. So rather than just throw a number out, as some people sometimes do, and indeed have done in the past, rather than just chuck that number on the table casually, we are going to do the proper work to have a robust, defensible answer to that question.
But you have chucked a number out, 300,000. You said it's going to be a lot lower than that. If we're around sort of the 750,000 mark right now when it comes to net migration, a really important question to ask is who exactly you don't want coming into the country anymore. Now, you can say you're not going to put an exact figure on it. I'm not going to push you to, but you must have a rough estimate on the hundreds of thousands of people you want to cut down on. Is it students? Is it people working in the care service? Is it the NHS? Is it refugees? Is it family members? Can you give us any indication? Because that's a significant reduction you've already committed to.
So first of all, behind that, the net number, as you said, is 750,000. That should actually go down as a result of changes made by the last Conservative government, which will kind of filter through this year and next year. So we lifted all the salary thresholds. We made it harder to bring in dependents. So that number will come down naturally as a result of previous policy changes. But behind that, taking that 750 number last year, which is way too high, catastrophically too high, the number arriving was actually about 1.2 million. Right, 1.2 million arrived, about, I think it was 700 and something thousand departed. So that number of 1.2 is just absurdly too high. Now, many of those people actually didn't come here for work purposes. Many of those people were dependents. Taking the health and social care route as an example, which is huge, it was like 300,000 people over time. I think an average person coming in to work in a basically minimum wage job was bringing It depends on the nationality, but some nationalities were 2, 3, 4, even 5 dependents per person.
But the Tories
we
have
don't
done
want that.
this, right? The Tories did the crackdown on dependents. As you say, that is going to reduce the figure probably to something closer to 400,000, maybe 500,000.
Right, so that's doing some of the heavy lifting. So you're asking me how we're going to get from
I'm
750
asking-
down,
I'm
and that is
ask-
part of the answer. That is part of the answer.
No. I'm asking how you're going to get from about 500,000 down to 200,000, 100,000. Can you give me a rough estimation of the types of migrants that you're going to be cracking down on?
Yeah, well, to get from 750, which is the starting point, right down, right, the dependence is certainly one area, which we started doing already, and because the last government announced it, and we can probably go further. So we don't think people should be bringing in dependents if they're working on like very low wage jobs. In fact, we were proposing to increase the threshold even further. So you had to earn, I think it was £38,400 before you could bring into a dependent. That change was due to take effect on the 8th of April this year. The Labour government have suspended that change. It's not clear if they're going to implement it or not. I think it should be implemented. That would deliver a significant further reduction in numbers. And to answer the question sort of more broad, so dependence is one area. A second area is low skill jobs. So you've mentioned the social care sector as an example. Now, I think it was absurd to ship in hundreds of thousands of people to work in the social care sector on essentially minimum wage jobs, which only require 2 to 3 weeks training. Many of those hundreds of thousands of people were dependents. They weren't even the people that were going to be working actually in the care home. They were like spouses, they were children and whatnot, right? That was wrong. We should not have done that. That should not have happened when we've got 9.3 million people of working age who could train for those jobs. And I would like to see the benefit system getting made a little more demanding so that the people who are, for example, in receipt of benefits, are better incentivised to get into the workforce. And frankly, employers should also be doing a better job to recruit and train domestically rather than shipping in large numbers of low-skilled migrants.
If recent history is anything to go off, and perhaps we'll see some miracle overnight in the public sector if the Tories were to come back into power, we're getting people back into work, millions of working age people who could be working, maybe they're going back to work overnight. But let's say that proves tricky. Let's say it isn't actually possible to replace the health sector's staff with domestic workers overnight. Let's say your modeling suggests, as a lot of the numbers do, that the health system is propped up on migrant work. Will you be willing, based on evidence, to revise these numbers that you're throwing out?
Well, I mean, take the health service as an example. We artificially cap the number of doctors we train each year and then ship in the excess from other countries.
Right, but this is going to be a 25-year plan to undo, right? We're talking about a quarter of a century at least to undo that. My question is, the Tories are actually committing not to a very specific number, but to something under 300,000 net migrants a year. Well under. So I'm going to go with 150, maybe even 100, but I'm not making you put a number on it. My point is, can you be specific with our audience about the groups of people that overnight the Tories would just say, no, cap, you're out?
I just have been already. There's two. Let me talk. Let me reiterate two groups. So, people like dependents.
But that's already been done. That doesn't get you. That doesn't get you down.
It's been partly done because the highest salary threshold for dependents, the 38,400, has not yet been implemented. It was due to happen in April. It hasn't happened yet. So, area number one is going to be dependents. So that's like children, spouses of people earning wages up to 38,000. That's one area. And secondly, more broadly, people coming in on to work on low salaries in the social care sector, but also more widely. I just don't. I mean, the sort of picture you're painting, if I can say so, is a little bit defeatist. You're essentially, the thesis you're advancing is essentially that there is no alternative but to have 1.2 million people. 1.2 million people. That is an insane number coming in each year. And you're effectively, the sort of premise of your question, I know I'm pushing back a bit here, but the premise of your question is that is unavoidable. It's inevitable. You've got to do that for the sake of the economy. I just don't accept that. I don't accept, we need 1.2 million. If we keep doing that for 5 years, the numbers are going to be completely bonkers. I just don't accept that is necessary when we've got 9.3 million people here of working age who are not working. And I don't accept it when we as a country for decades have underinvested in technology and mechanisation compared to other countries like the Netherlands, countries like Japan, countries like South Korea, countries like Singapore. We've underinvested in technology and mechanisation, making us dependent on this sort of mass low-skill migration. I don't accept that as an inevitability. There is a different path we could take as a nation. It's a different path that we should take, and that is the path that we're advocating for.
I think the only thesis that I'm promoting in this conversation is just that the numbers don't quite add up, and I'm trying to make them add up. If I look at the 2022 breakdown of net migration, where you had almost 1 million people net coming into the country, 321,000 of those people were students. So just looking at the students alone, we are well above what you have said is a figure that's far too high. You're saying it's going to be well below 300,000 net migrants. Well, students accounted for 321,000 people in 2022. When I ask you which groups aren't coming here, to say something that's already been decided by the previous Tory government, to say another
half
figure
of which
that
has not been implemented yet, right? The higher salary threshold has not been implemented.
To say it,
to be
sure,
fair.
but we're still talking about a couple 100,000 people. You say that's far too many to be talking about in the first place, but I say, great, well that's a dent. Where are you going next? And I think this is a question people want answered, regardless of whether you're pro or anti-immigration, you're voting Labour, you're voting Reform on this issue of immigration. If students alone don't get you anywhere near your target, who isn't coming here anymore?
Yeah, so look, I mean, this is why it needs to be modelled more, because that net student figure obviously includes people that have come here after COVID. I think you quoted a 2022 figure. A lot of people came here after COVID to study. Now, they are due to leave, or in theory they're due to leave, in like about 3 to 4 years after that arrival time. So the net student figure was very high in 2022 for the reason I just said, and you maybe picked that year because it was the highest.
Students tend to be around 250, 300,000.
Well, see, come a couple of years' time, that should in theory drop down as they leave. Now, if it doesn't drop down, what that means is students are coming here and then staying. And that then means that body of students, if they do come here and stay and switch from the graduate route to a work visa route, right, that means they are then available for the workforce. That needs to be accounted for as well. So, it's obvious from this just exchange here, that is exactly the complexities that we've just touched on are exactly the reason why we haven't just chucked out a figure. We're going to go through these questions like properly on a big spreadsheet to make sure that when we do put a number on this, it's been properly thought through. But what I think will be clear to your viewers and listeners from this conversation are the principles. The principles are the numbers have got to come a long way down. 1.2 million people coming in, 750 net is bonkers. We don't need to do that. There is an alternative. It's to do with getting our own people back into the workforce, and it's to do with technology and mechanisation. And I think those are principles that the vast majority of the British public would agree with.
Would the Tories take students out of the net migration figures?
No, because if students come here and end up staying, then that is part of net migration. Now, if they come and then leave, by definition, they sort of can't...
Sure, so you would take students out of net migration, and then when they transfer to a graduate visa, that would be part of the net migration figures.
I think we'd leave all of them in. I think it's a bit dishonest to sort of exclude a certain population. To the extent students come here and then leave, they automatically, effectively exclude themselves from the net figure, right? Because arrivals and departures will balance each other out. But I think we should leave them in, because to not do so would be, I think, dishonest.
Well, okay, last point on the students, then I'll ask you one final question. I suppose I'm confused by the past two answers you just gave, because as I pointed out, students already take you over your net migration figures. You say, well, it's nuanced, they might leave. That's a very important point. So why are they in the net migration figures? If you want to keep them there, you're going to have to kick everybody else out. As I said, my only thesis to you today is that these numbers don't quite add up. And you say you haven't put an exact figure on it. But if you're telling me that we're looking at 150,000 people coming in a year, you're going to have to kick out everybody and half the students.
Well, don't forget, it's about inflow, isn't it? We're talking about issuing visas to people that want to come in next year, the year after. Right? We're looking forward rather than backwards. The ILR policy we talked about before is about people here already. The visa cap is about people that might come in the future. Just to kind of be clear about that. And as I say, we need to look at the modelling of whether those students that have arrived in quite large numbers over the last couple of years, and I think you chose the highest year, 2022, we need to look at whether they are going to leave. If they're not going to leave, then we do need to account for them as part of the total net figure. If they are going to end up in the workforce, that will mean, if lots of people come here to study and then stay here and get a work visa, that does mean that we'll be issuing less work visas to other people. And it may mean that we need to have a cap on we need to have a cap on how many of those students that come here do end up getting a work visa. Because if someone comes here, does a course of maybe questionable quality, and then proposes to get a work visa on a low-paid job, frankly, that's probably not a work visa that we would want to give. So that student number you mentioned, could well come down a lot with the visa cap that we mentioned, because we wouldn't allow this transfer from the student route to the work route that has been happening on an industrial scale.
Well, it might have to come down overall to deal with the net migration if they're not coming out of that figure. But let me ask you one more question, and I suppose this is actually the main question on my mind about the visa policies proposed by the Tories, and that's a question of competitiveness in the world. Because if you are 25, being brought over to the UK as a migrant by the kinds of companies that, again, you've suggested, banks, you might be in finance, you might be a top lawyer, these kinds of migrants coming to the UK, the new offer to them is that it's going to take 15 years to be confident that you'll be settled here. And you'll be asking people to make that calculation when they might be wanting to buy a home, when they might be wanting to start a family, not sure for 15 years if they can really call Britain their home. Are you not worried that the exact types of migrants that the Tory party says it wants, the best and the brightest, might think to themselves, that's too risky, I may look elsewhere, or I may stay at home?
Well, the time period to have confidence of stay is 10 years rather than 15, because at 10 years, we're proposing you get indefinite leave to remain. And as the name implies, indefinite means you can stay here forever. So that confidence point...
But you won't be British.
That confidence point arrives after 10 years, when you know you can stay here for good. Look, I think the offer we can make internationally is to say that this is we want to make this a vibrant, dynamic economy. I think London is like the best city on earth to come and live and to work, whatever sector you're working in. I want the entire country, the whole United Kingdom, to be a dynamic, vibrant economy. And I'm sure my colleagues in the Shadow Cabinet will over time set out a plan to reduce the regulatory burden, reduce the tax burden, to fix the problems that the Labour government is imposing on our country, to make this a vibrant and dynamic place to come. That is going to be our mission and our objective in government, and I'm hopeful a future Conservative administration will make sure that from the best and the brightest from all four corners of the earth will want to work here. But we'll say the condition is, you've got to be making a real contribution. You've got to be actually contributing to the Exchequer and to other taxpayers, not being a drain. We've got to get the numbers right down. But for those people who really can make a difference to our country and our economy, those are the people we want to attract here, and I'm confident that we will be able to do that.
And finally, Brianna Wu sat down with Natasha Feroz to discuss gender, gaming and politics.
I've been watching some of your interviews recently, and obviously you have always spoken in favour of being a Democrat. I've just spent some time in New York, and I've been speaking to lots of Democrats there now. What is it like being a Democrat in the first few weeks, months of Trump 2.0?
It is like being in Japan right after World War II, where your side has lost and half the people you're talking to don't understand you've lost the war and you need to do something different. It's fairly frustrating, I feel very, very strongly the Democrats have been pursuing a playbook, one that I helped pioneer, one that really leans in on giving women and minorities a fairer shake. I think 10 years into that playbook, we can see very clearly it's not leading to better policy. It's not leading to electoral wins. And it's very obvious to me we need to find a new way forward. And it's really frustrating that so many people in the party are so eager to attack Trump when we keep trying to do that and it's not winning us elections. So I'm trying to convince everyone around me that, yes, Trump is doing some terrible things, but our top priority has got to be fixing our party. It is fundamentally broken.
I was surprised to see, even with all these executive orders, these are some of the things that he was doing couldn't be fathomed in his first presidency. And there hasn't been much resistance. A friend of mine said who's a Democrat, said, frankly, she's just exhausted. But the Democrats know how to get onto the streets and protest. And I understand what you mean about fixing the party, but where is the resistance, do you think?
I think it's a really good question. I think Democrats are demoralized. We're exhausted. I also think, frankly, we are leaderless right now. One of the consequences of Biden, and look, I'm just going to speak really frankly here. I love my party. I am a Democrat. But Biden was so senile, he barely appeared on television for 4 years. We were a party without any message. We were a party without any policy direction other than some vagaries. And I think in the aftermath, we're looking at the Biden presidency very honestly and seeing how we were promised a lot of things, but there was not any political capital put into achieving any of them. So one of the consequences of us having a remarkably weak leader for 4 years is, where is this strength coming from? Right now, the strongest person in our party is probably Gavin Newsom. And if you think a California Democrat is coming to the rescue to lead our party into a new chapter, like, you're just crazy. So I think, unfortunately, we're in a position where we're dealing with the choices we've made, which is to put our fingers in our ears, pretend Biden was a competent, very capable president, when the reality was he was a senile old man. And it hurts me to say, because I think he was a good president, but it's still the truth.
Are you what one might call a never Trumper?
No, I don't think I would be. We tried that in 2016. And, I think about where our party is today, and it's weaker than ever. I think the American people are just tired of us screaming all the time. And frankly, Trump is putting some policies into action that I agree with. He's standing with Israel, for instance, in a way that Biden was just simply unwilling to. I very strongly support that policy. So the way I feel is, when Trump is doing good things, I, as a Democratic operative, am going to praise him for that publicly. I'll give him credit for the good things he does, because that way, when he does really bad things, we will have credibility in speaking up and fighting back.
Yeah, as a journalist, it seems impossible that any opposition can credit another opposition these days, which has always seemed like an obvious thing to me.
I mean, can I just ask you, as a journalist, it's got to be obvious to you that something's got to change in American politics. We've tried hating each other with everything that we've got for every single year I've been alive. Like, I remember when Newt Gingrich in the contract with America, what was that, 1994? And I remember thinking politics could never be more caustic than that with the government shutdown. And it's just gotten worse every single year I've been alive. And I think at some point, if there is a future for the Democratic Party and a future with America on the world stage, we're going to have to get some adults in charge that can talk to the other side and figure out some things with national security, tax policy, investing in infrastructure. Like, clearly just opposing the other side automatically is not good for America. So I think, like, maybe I'm being naive, but I think a lot of Republicans are tired of this too. And I think maybe we can finally build something together.
You stood in the primaries in 2018, was it?
Mm-hmm.
And
yes.
Do you think you would have been the type of politician that could tap into the other side, or is this something like a conclusion that you've come to now that you've seen the election result this year?
I think anyone following my career can tell my politics have changed very dramatically. And, sometimes people accuse me of, like, being disingenuous with that. And it's like, no, I've had a front row seat to the dysfunction and dishonesty of the progressive movement for 10 years now. For 10 years now. I literally just a couple of weeks ago was in a meeting where we broke out into a screaming match, not me, but some of the people in the meeting, because someone said, "You guys," accidentally, and that gendered someone in the audience. And it's stupid. It's childish. And for whatever reason, this progressive playbook, it is correct in thinking that we need structural reform with our policies that are focused on the working class. The reality of that playbook, though, is fragmenting us and causing us to obsess about identity in ways that make it impossible for us to move forward as Americans together. And yeah, I'm fairly radically turned against that now. So, in some ways is probably better for the country that I lost back then.
Do you still have any ambitions to go into politics, or do you wish you had been elected, or do you look back on it and think, I dodged a bullet there?
No, so you can probably hear it in my voice right now. I'm fairly hoarse. I am dealing with a congenital voice issue where I can only speak for a few hours a day. So as much as I want to help my country in this moment, like, you can't run for office if you can only speak for 3 or 4 hours a day. And I've just had to accept that there are other ways to serve my country. One of the ways I do it is fundraising strategy, getting resources in back channel, helping on legislation. There's plenty of things I can do other than being an elected official.
On the policy topic and politics, I know that you have been an advocate for trans healthcare. I wanted to ask you about how, when you transitioned, how far the science and research has changed in trans healthcare, and how your transition could have been different, just, in terms of the operation, or feel free to expand as you wish, had you had your operation in 2025.
Oh my God. I thank God every day that I transitioned 20 years ago, because the system I transitioned under has nothing to do with the lunatic fringe politics that have hijacked the trans movement today. I think anyone looking at the trans community can see we are more neurotic and more miserable and more unhealthy than we have ever been. And the reason for that is this fringe, insane, progressive nut job class has taken over what used to be a medical issue that affected a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of young boys. And they have expanded it and changed the definitions of it, where literally every bored teenage girl in America is convincing herself she's non-binary, is considering shooting herself up with testosterone. I'm telling you, as someone that has looked at the science as closely as I can, in good faith, these policies that they are pushing are completely untethered from anything we can scientifically justify. It is hurting people. It is turning everyone against the trans movement, and we have got to stop. Trans healthcare and trans rights have got to be based in science and reality, and not some fringe progressive agenda that teaches a generation of people that gender is completely unmoored to sex and you can opt in or opt out of it at will with no medicalization. It is truly insanity. And I am horrified by what this has become.
And obviously, a lot of people now are detransitioning as well. I've read a couple of stories of people who had puberty blockers as children, have decided that the transition wasn't right for them, are detransitioning and now suing their parents for making these decisions on their behalf when they felt like it wasn't for them. How difficult do you find it to navigate that parental decision over what could be a suicidal feeling for a child, and actually giving the child the ability to grow out of what could be a phase?
Sure. So it's very complicated, but the baseline is parents have not been told the truth. Politics have hijacked trans healthcare, and parents are not being told the truth. They're being told if they affirm their children, that if they don't affirm their children, they're going to commit suicide. That's not true. And, the reality is, like, even as someone who medically transitioned, who is extremely happy with my transition, I cannot imagine life any other way. If I had a child tomorrow and they were a natal female telling me they wanted to transition, I would force them to wait until they were 18 before I gave them testosterone. The rates of detransition for natal girls is through the roof. We don't know why, but just for whatever reason, boys that want to be girls don't regret this at anywhere near the rates. And the other part of this is testosterone works just as well for them if you give it to them at 15 versus 25. So what is the rush? It's insane to me. There's no reason a natal female should be going and getting a double mastectomy at 14 years old. We're over medicalizing these kids. And I want to be clear. There are some cases, some really, really rare cases of boys that want to be girls where it is in their favor to get them time or to intervene because testosterone could be so destructive to your ability to live an integrated life. But that's not what we're doing. Do you understand? We are taking people that literally don't even want to be women. They just want to be something in between or have softer skin. And we're giving them hormones. It is insane to me. There's no study I can point to justify this. The entire system is broken. It needs to be rebuilt today.
I don't know if you're familiar with, we had a psychiatrist on Spectator TV called Az Hakim. He believed in group therapy for kids with gender dysphoria.
Sure.
Because he believed what part of the problem was if you put a child in a room and you quiz them about what their issues are, they internalize a lot of problems and it almost manifests in itself. Whereas if you put them in a group, they might feel as if they can see all the different variations of people struggling with their gender, with their identity, and actually they're not alone. And I think he said that at sort of 8 or 9 out of 10 left not wanting to transition or anything like that. Do you think that could have been, are there other ways of helping children that are just completely unexplored?
I mean, I think that's fairly obvious, right? There's an assumption built into this version of the trans movement that everyone needs to be medically affirmed, which is just plainly insanity. My message to anyone is the healthcare I got by any measure was extreme. If you can find ways to live your life without it, do that. Like, it's really serious. The things that I went through permanently changed my body. I'm going to have to take estrogen for the rest of my life. I am weaker. I cannot run as fast. And, it was a challenge socially to integrate. I did all those things. I've been very happily married to a man for 17 years, but this is not a path for everyone. So I think we've got to get over this fear, which is the only way the activists seem to be able to message this, where every single person we don't automatically affirm or give another path is a tragedy somehow. It's clearly the opposite. We are over-medicalizing this. And just the last thing I'm going to say about this, where have the transvestites gone? Because when I transitioned 20 years ago, there were two groups of people. There were the transsexuals, people like me that wanted to be women, and there were natal males with a fetish for wearing women's clothes that did not want to transition. I think people don't understand. This has been rolled into the trans umbrella. Some studies show this is like 3% of men. And you can look at textbooks from the 60s, and they will say that like giving transvestites hormones does not serve them. And of course it doesn't serve them. It like will dull the sexual desire that drives their behavior. They don't act like women when you get them on this stuff. So the problem is the politics are going ahead of the healthcare. I want every single person that is looking for help with gender dysphoria to get a treatment that is going to work for them. And we need to stop being so afraid of this answer not looking exactly like people like me.
But how do you find the balance between, and even just you, you must have a lot of kids or young people that are influenced by you and they come up to you and they say, Brianna, I want to change sex. How do you find the balance between celebrating, championing who you are and how much it's radically changed your life for the better, but then also accepting that it might not be the right life for them and it is extremely, it can be very difficult, very painful and dangerous?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would do is be honest with those children and say, you can't change your sex. Like, I am a natal male. I always will be. When I go through life, people treat me as a woman. I look like a woman. I act like that. But I have to be honest about what I am. I'm somebody that got healthcare and it changed how people perceive me. So we need to be honest about the treatments that we're giving them for starters. I think the other is people like to act like this is really complicated. And the truth is we actually know a lot about these different categories of people. If someone comes to me and they go, I've got a child that's 5 years old, they're a natal boy, they're saying they want to be a girl. I know some things. I know that there's a 90% chance if you leave that kid alone, they're just going to grow up and be gay. And a 10% chance they're going to end up like me. If that same parent comes to me and says, my child started having onset of this when they were in like 7th grade, I understand that's a different type of transsexual. They're probably going to grow up attracted to women or other trans girls, and they're going to be on a different trajectory. They're probably not going to get married to a man. So the reality is we actually do know a lot about this. It doesn't mean you shove people into categories, but we're so afraid to unpack the complexity. Just one more example, autism is through the roof right now with trans people. I didn't know one person with autism when I transitioned 20 years ago. Nowadays, it's easily a third to half of the community. And people with autism just transition for different psychological reasons. They have more trouble integrating as women. They do it for different reasons. Like, why not have an honest conversation about all of this if it's healthcare? It just blows my mind.
Going on to the trans community and adults, and forgive my ignorance here, but
Sure.
would what you call you said earlier, where are the transvestites? Would they typically now be deemed to be people who have autogynephilia, and then the transsexuals are the ones that have gender dysphoria? Is that how you might categorize them?
No, boy, if you want to get into typology, like there are some transsexuals that have autogynephilia and they transition and the feelings abate and they end up as normal women, right? I think there's a misnomer out there that autogynephilia equals the bad kind. And, homosexual, transsexual equals the good kind. But it is true that a lot of transvestites do have autogynephilic fantasies, sexual fantasies of being a woman. So this is where healthcare really, really matters. I think every single one of those people deserves the right to sit down with a therapist that truly understands that typology, that can walk them through it and can help them find something that's going to work for them. Because what ends up happening is if you get those transvestites, those men with low body dysmorphia that do have these sexual fantasies, and you pump them full of anti-androgens, which kills their sexual desire, and put them on estrogen, they don't do well. They aren't women, so they don't act like women after you do that, and they don't integrate as women. So you're just not getting them what they need.
For our audience that don't know, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but someone who has autogynephilia is where being a woman and a transition to a woman is a fetish, is a sexual fantasy. Should they be treated, when it comes to making policies, should they be categorized differently as a trans person? And do you find that you're often fighting on behalf of that category that people worry about more? And I'm talking about so-called TERFs here. I think a lot of them would be are the ones that often say some trans people are pervs and it's a fetish, and is it that differentiation between someone who's transitioned as has autogynephilia and someone that isn't, and it's gender dysphoria, that is where you can become not you specifically, but one can become unstuck?
Well, see, so the typology is it's applying sexology to transitioning, right? And it's a helpful lens. I think that one of the things is this typology has become so politicized that people just use this to mean good type and bad type. So it's like, if you put a gun to my head, look, I'm obsessed with Sophie Ellis-Bextor, right? I love her. I can sing Murder on the Dance Floor all day long. I'm more HSTS than anything else, by far. But at the same time, it's that's not why I transitioned. I transitioned because of my identity. and because of who I wanted to be. And the typology really leaves all that on the floor. So I think that what is more helpful is we need to train therapists to understand these sexology concepts to help patients get health care. I don't think it makes sense to say, like, this is a good type, this is a bad type of transsexual. And there's also like a misnomer that HSTS transsexuals, homosexual transsexuals, are like we can be some fairly embarrassing women just because we tend to act like drag queens sometimes. So it's very hard to integrate in some ways. So there's no easy way to be trans, basically.
Difficult question for you, Brianna. I want to ask you about J.K. Rowling. She's someone we've spoken about a lot of times on Spectator TV. And one of our writers, Debbie Hayton, who is a trans woman, once wrote that Debbie believes J.K. Rowling's taken the TERF movement too far and has become quite malicious. It's something we've debated a lot, and I wanted to get your view because I know that you've written that you think that J.K. Rowling is a transphobe. Could you expand on that a bit?
I think it's complicated because I think this version of the trans community, people need to understand. I look up Brianna Wu and look up Gamergate. So 10 years ago, I was one of the people that started this culture war with gamers sending me death threats, rape threats, threatening to murder me, threatening to murder my husband, my dogs. Like, it was a real hell of a time. So it's very painful to me to look at trans activists because I have to admit that trans activists have treated J.K. Rowling the exact same way that Gamergate treated me. Anyone can look at her mentions and see just virulent sexism. They can see rape threats. They can see death threats. They can see dehumanization. They can see moralizing and an unwillingness to engage in any of her points. So I want to be clear. I understand why she's angry. I am furious at the way trans people have treated J.K. Rowling. At the same point, she has been radicalized. And I think she's really moved to a point where she is so degrading in ways that she does not understand. I don't feel personally like she's looking for solutions anymore. I think she's looking to take out her anger on a population. And what I really feel here is we have two sides that have become radicalized. I think you've got the trans fringe over here. They've insisted on some politics. They're completely unmoored from science. And I think you've got this TERF project over here, this gender critical project that truly believes in pushing us out of public life. And the answer is in the middle, obviously. We've got to rethink the policy about which natal males are getting access to medical transition and going into women's spaces, right? In America, all too often, there are stories about women having to see penises in locker rooms. I don't want that. That horrifies me. That's awful public policy. So the question is, where can the sane, normal people come in the middle here and have a real discussion about how do we balance women's rights and trans women's rights and give dignity to everyone? It's obvious to me there are policy compromises we can make. And it breaks my heart that J.K. Rowling is not part of that solution. She's welcome to reach out to me anytime. I would love to have a conversation.
Do you think, obviously, with so-called TERFs, a lot of them are in the lesbian community.
Sure.
And can you see that they've obviously suffered their own form of prejudice? So is it quite interesting to you that they then are, by the trans community, who often call them prejudice?
I think that the way trans women have treated lesbian and women's spaces is deeply embarrassing. It makes me angry, to be honest with you. When I transitioned 20 years ago, I'm not into women, so I've never even been to a lesbian bar. But, the trans people I knew that were into women understood there was a tremendous amount of caution and respect and buy-in that you needed to have to go into those spaces. And that is just gone today. I see stories all the time about trans women that don't look like women in any way, shape, or form on these lesbian dating apps, asking people to do things to their genitals. It is disgusting. And, I don't blame lesbians for being so traumatized by us, because we are acting like entitled men in the way that we are approaching this relationship. I don't know how to fix it other than humility and to admit that we've broken the social contract and to try to reset things. So if any lesbians are looking at this, I'm sorry, it's embarrassing the way that my community has behaved. This is what happens when you don't bother socializing an entire generation of trans women. I'm sorry.
I suppose what a TERF would say back to you is on this topic of compromise, where it becomes impossible is that as soon as you have a situation where a trans person wants to enter a space that is not what their biological sex is, you're breaking a boundary that has been created. And then how do you have rules? At what point, when you have a compromise, at what point do boundaries constantly get broken? We actually, as we speak, there's a tribunal going on because a doctor, a trans doctor, was getting changed in a woman's changing room, and the nurse complained about it, and so the trans doctor has filed a formal complaint, and now it's going through a tribunal. And I suppose, how would you, one thing that all these Twitter spats often go back to this idea of compromise. And I think for the thing that might puzzle lots of people is, how can you have a compromise when you don't have a clear set of boundaries? Because you're just constantly going to be dealing with these grey areas, which is exactly what this tribunal is doing.
Yeah, I think it's really complicated. I can tell you, for me, I've had vaginoplasty. I think I pass reasonably well, but when I go to the gym, I shower at home, just because if someone can tell I'm trans, I don't want to upset them. I think that, I think women deserve the right to say, no, we don't feel comfortable with you in our space. But I also think trans women deserve to have health care and a right to employment and a life. And, if I were on that tribunal, I actually don't think it's that big a deal to ask someone that's a doctor to get change in a private room, right? I really don't think that's a big deal. I think the social contract is all of us trying to get along with each other as best as we can. So I would say to my sisters out there, I understand that it can be dehumanizing the way that we're treated sometimes. The way that TERFs talk to us is it's brutal. It is cruel. It is so mean, but we will get so much further with getting goodwill from the public, with humility and grace, and trying to get people to buy in and for them to see our humanity, than we will by forcing them to with the force of law to allow us to do things. And I would also say, don't discount just how much better this has gotten in my lifetime. I think people do not appreciate just how much better it is to be trans today than it was 20 years ago. The surgery to feminize you is through the roof better. The public awareness is better. Just top to bottom, we have so many advantages that we didn't used to have. So I would just beg people to just try to have some patience with people.
Do you worry about the money going into trans healthcare? Because lots of people talk about big pharma. As soon as something becomes profitable, there's so much money in this. It's not really talked about enough how responsible private doctors are for encouraging people to have gender affirming surgery.
Well, I think it's two ways. The cost to my insurance company of me being trans is $10 a month. I take estrogen and that's it. No one paid for a dime of any of my health care except for me. But at the same time, I think if being trans is healthcare, and I believe it is, and not something you self-ID into, I think there's a role for these clinics to take care of it. Where I would really draw a line, and where I think it's gone too far, and to be clear, I'm speaking more about United States healthcare policy. Sure. I don't understand the ins and outs of the NHS as well. But I know for a fact here in Massachusetts, what we've done is dismantled the gatekeeping, the medical safeguarding that I had to go through to certify myself as being transsexual. And if you'll just bear with me, I think this will really help your viewers understand this. So when I wanted to go on hormones 20 years ago, I first had to go to a therapist extensively for at least 3 months and talk to them and meet a clinical diagnosis of gender dysphoria. These were the old school standards, which were much higher than they were today. So then I had to take that letter written by a clinician to a doctor. That doctor had to look into the clinician, make sure they were legit, ask me questions, make sure I was representing myself honestly. Then they did a bunch of blood work to make sure that it was safe for me to go on hormones. And then slowly we started doing it with ramping up the dosage. Then I had to go live and work for a full year as a woman. This had to be documented. I couldn't stay home and stay on the computer. I had to go out there and socialize, make friends as a woman, get employed as a woman, start dating men, all those things.
What was that like?
Yeah, I had to. It was great. I loved it. I took to it like a fish to water, but it also forced me to socialize, right? There are rules to being a woman that you won't learn if you're sitting in your apartment online.
Yeah.
And then finally, at the end of that, I had to go get an additional 2 letters. One of them from a literal psychologist, which was very expensive, who did an extensive case history on me, arguing to a surgeon why I should be qualified to get vaginoplasty. And then I took it to that doctor to get it. This was a long years process of going through this that made sure I was transsexual, made sure I really had gender dysphoria, and helped socialize me as a woman. This is my point with your question. Today, all of those systems are gone thanks to trans activists. They're gone. I could take you literally today to Planned Parenthood in Massachusetts and get you on testosterone this afternoon if you wanted to.
Yeah.
You could start becoming a boy today.
Yeah.
No background, no therapy, just signing a letter saying you understand the consequences. This is insane. And because the standards are so much lower today, your ability to get surgery, we're funneling people into getting surgery that's not going to serve in the long run. So I understand your complaint about the cost, but it's not the access to this. It's the lack of safeguarding to make sure the right people are getting that care, if that makes sense to you.
Lastly, Brianna, I just want to ask you about gaming, which is a topic I know less about than most people. Is gaming something that parents should be worried about for their kids?
Yeah, absolutely. We've got studies that show that spending too much time in online games, it doesn't permanently stop your social development, but it does slow it down. It can lower your empathy in some cases. There are also situations like children with autism. If you put them in Minecraft servers with other children with autism, it can be a remarkably positive social experience. So I think like everything else, it's, if it's excessive, you need to look at that. But certainly I think parents need to play a role in what their kids are playing today. It is fairly terrifying. It will never stop shocking me that I can boot up the Nintendo Switch today and see all these extremely sexy, inappropriate games for adults with a lot of extremely suggestive sexual themes, and that's just offered to every 8-year-old out there. It just seems insane to me, but I don't run those servers.
What happened to the days of Donkey Kong? I know you were
well, I still like Donkey Kong.
You liked Peach, Princess Peach? You're a big fan?
I am the number 2 Princess Peach speedrunner in the entire world, so.
Who's number 1?
It's a guy that I've been trying to beat for a long time. I've got this pesky job that gets in the way. So
amazing. Brianna Wu, thank you so much for joining us on Spectator TV.
That's all for this week. Don't forget to leave your feedback at the bottom. Until next time.